Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, members of the committee. Welcome witnesses to the fourth meeting of the Legislative Committee on Bill C11. We'll get right to introductions from the Canadian Federation of Musicians. Bill Skolnick, did I say your name correctly? Great, thank you, welcome. And Warren Sheffer.
Thank you.
From Pine Ridge Broadcasting, Don Conway.
Yes, sir.
From Resound Music Licensing Company, Ian Mackay. And Matthew Fortier, the Director of Communications. Welcome, gentlemen. So each of you have been informed that you have 10 minutes maximum for opening presentations. So that's total for each organization. So after 10 minutes, I will unfortunately have to cut you off. So hopefully we can get that done within 10 minutes. And starting off with that, I'll hand it over to Mr. Skolnick.
Thanks very much, and thank you very much for having us, the Canadian Federation of Musicians, and on behalf of the other witnesses as well. I am Bill Skolnick. I am a musician. I worked in theater. I worked in television. I worked in radio, different studios for a long time. I did a lot of writing for Sesame Street, so I may have affected some of you right here. I'm now the Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Federation of Musicians, and joining me today is Warren Sheffer, who is our counsel and a lawyer with Heaven Sheffer. CFM has represented musicians in Canada for more than 100 years, and many of our 17,000 members are international stars and household names, but the majority are not. And even though I get elected to serve the 17,000 folks that live here, there are a number of musicians, of course, who are not our members, but according to the Canadian Artists and Producers of the CAPART, I'm sure you're familiar with it, we speak on their behalf as well when it comes to federal matters. So I'm not just speaking really on behalf of the folks that pay my salary, but I'm speaking on behalf of anybody who picks up an instrument and gets paid for it right now. Musicians are self-employed business owners, and oftentimes they earn less than $20,000 a year. While they make some of their wages from performing, hitting the road, a significant portion of their income comes from recordings and the rights to past performances and work. So you may not realize it, but when you go to like the Sanderson Center or the National Arts Center or Center in the Square, I guess every theater is called Center in this country, that those players that you see accompanying stars, accompanying featured performers, they aren't with those featured performers from city to city. They are hired. They're hired by a leader, by a music director, and they operate as independent business people. Some of you may know these folks. I know most of them, and I'm going to give you some names so you can acquaint yourselves with them from the smaller places. From Sudbury, Christian Robertson, Victor Sawa, Yoko Hiroda. Originally from Truro, the three Grey Boys, John, Charlie, and Phil, who now live in Toronto. I think John lives in Vancouver. He wrote Billy Bishop, but they're from a small town in Nova Scotia. From Kitchener, Frank Leahy, well-known player. Wendell Ferguson, one of the funniest guys in Canada. Doug Perry, Paul Mitchell. Peterborough, the Cherney brothers, who don't live in Peterborough anymore, but their father was a well-known appliance dealer. Washboard Hank, if anybody has ever seen Washboard Hank play, you know who I mean. These are our members. These are the people I'm talking about. The Leahy family, well-known from Lakefield, well-known. Frank the Felice from Brantford, Gary Munn, Rusty James. You may know these folks. And from Sackville, Ray Legere. I'm just giving you these names because these are people who bought houses, raised their children, and they don't necessarily live in the big cities. Some of them do. They're from the small towns. This is who I'm talking about. These are the small business people that I'm referring to. Musicians can only make a living if there are robust copyright laws that allow them to negotiate and exploit their rights in the marketplace through collective bargaining and collective licensing. Diminished rights means diminished income. We really support the government's effort to modernize the Copyright Act by implementing provisions of the WIPO Internet treaties. In particular, we welcome the establishment of moral rights for performers. That's really vital to us. We acknowledge the government's desire to address the fact that people are enjoying music in a digital format anywhere and any time. However, just because digital technology has made it easy for works to be reproduced, it doesn't mean that it should be free. Technological advances cannot be a rationale for diminishing or depriving creators and performers of their rights to be rewarded for reproducing and using their work. Music has value. This work is the product of creative labor, and it has value, still has value. Unfortunately, in too many places, this bill removes the value. The Canadian Conference of the Arts has put together a package of 20 technical amendments to C11. CFM is one of the 68 cultural organizations that help put those together, and we fully endorse each of those amendments. I want to stress how remarkable an achievement it is to get these diverse organizations to agree on this package. Today, I want to talk specifically to 4 amendments that would go a long way to protecting the intellectual property and income of musicians. Number 1, put a fence around the widespread exceptions to copyrights and neighboring rights introduced in the bill by including explicit language from the Berne 3-step test. The Berne 3-step test, as found in the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, TRIPS, to which Canada adheres, provides that, quote, members shall confine limitations and exceptions to exclusive rights to certain special cases which do not conflict with the normal exploitation of the work and do not unreasonably prejudice the legitimate interests of the rights holder. We want users to be able, unquote, we want users to be able to access and enjoy our members' work, whether for personal enjoyment or education, but not at the expense of the musicians that seek to make a living from the use of their works and performances. Make this provision explicitly in the Act, and it will get the government and the courts on the same page. User-generated content. Number 2. This is an example of where the 3-step test would be helpful by putting fences around exemptions. The UGC or mashup provision is a remarkable departure from the objective of the Copyright Act to confer exclusive rights on creators and performers. We understand what the intent is here, to allow families to post videos of their kids dancing to pop music and without breaking the law. That's reasonable. But the wording in the bill goes too far for us. It would remove the ability of creators to license or have any say in what happens to their work. YouTube is the big winner here at the expense of creators. We recommend the exception be removed altogether, or at a minimum, amend it so moral rights are properly protected. We need to leave the door open for collectors to enter into agreements with businesses like YouTube so that performers can get paid, as is the case in other countries. I can tell you from my perspective, a lot of our members are as much concerned about control of what their property is, their works are, as they are about the payment. Both are important, but control is a real big aspect with respect to moral rights. They need to have some teeth behind those. 3, statutory damages. C11 proposes to drastically reduce statutory damages for infringement. That is, for non-commercial purposes, to between $100 and $5,000. This is not an adequate deterrent. We also see no need to make a new distinction between commercial and non-commercial infringement. Such a distinction conveys the wrong message that so-called non-commercial infringement is not at all harmful to creators and performers. For example, I can take a CD, I can make 100 copies of it and give it to everyone I know for Christmas. I'm not making money off it, but that's potentially 100 copies of the CD the artists aren't going to sell. It only makes it harder and less worthwhile for small business people with limited resources to pursue damages for infringement. We understand what the government intends with this change, but it's not necessary. We have seen no cases in Canada where individuals have been forced to pay exorbitant awards for copyright infringement. Even more puzzling is the bill's proposal to exempt those who enable acts of copyright infringement on the Internet from statutory damages. Statutory damage awards must be proportionate, a deterrent, and must be applicable to mass infringers like peer-to-peer sites who make tons of money off the backs of hard-working artists. And finally, private copying. CFM members earn more than $4 million from private copying in the past 10 years, and unfortunately, C11 will allow that critical source of income to dry up by not extending the private copying regime to new technologies. The revenue stream needs to be replaced, and I emphasize replaced, to recognize that long-standing principle that copies have value and that exclusive rights holders are to be compensated when copies are made. The first choice is to make the bill technology neutral by extending the current private copying regime to digital audio recorders that are designed, manufactured, and advertised for the purpose of copying music. But if the government chooses not to take that route, Part 8 of the Copyright Act should be supplemented by another restitutive mechanism. So what I'm saying here is there's a principle involved that's already been established, that copies have value, that people seem to have a right to make some money off that. We're not intending to say extend the technology if that's not palatable. We believe there are other methods. We have examples of other methods of getting remuneration to artists for the extended use of their copies, the storage, and the duplication. So it's the principle that we're arguing and the ability to keep that principle going and keep money going. You know, a musician would get statements. Like I say, they're business people, and they can't go to the bank and say, well, I've got 6-7 months of contracts coming up. I've got tours coming up, because they said, well, what if you get hit by a car? You know, what if that happens? But they can go, and they can go with those statements that they get from Resound and from Canadian Private Copying. They can go with other aspects of what shows their income is regardless of what happens to them. And they get money, and they don't need much. The average guy maybe gets $2,000 or $3,000 in private copying a year, but that can get him studio time. That can get him sidemen to play. This is an important aspect of their income, and it's been there for, what, 20 years, and it's now being removed. And it's being removed because of technology, not because anybody here believes they shouldn't get it.
Thank you, Mr.
That's 10 minutes?
That's
okay.
That's over 10 minutes, and
thank you.
thank you. Now I'll go to you, Mr. Conway.
Thank you, sir. Good morning. My name is Don Conway. I'm the president and majority owner of Pine Ridge Broadcasting. We're a small private broadcaster serving Cobourg, Port Hope, Northumberland County, Peterborough, the Kawarthas in Ontario. Thank you for inviting us to appear before you. I hope that by the time we part, you'll have an understanding of small market radio, the part we play in the everyday life and economy of our communities, and the financial stresses we live with each day in order to do that. Due to the tight timelines, my comments to you will be limited to my oral presentation, but I'd be pleased to follow up with any written submission if you require it. I was born in Chute-Blando, raised on a farm at Alexandria. I sold my first calf to buy a transistor radio so I could listen to music on the Cornwall station and the stations in Montreal to hear the play-by-play of Les Canadiens and Les Expos. I started in radio in 1974 as a sales rep in Brockville. In 1983, the owner purchased a little bankrupt AM radio station in Cobourg and asked me to go and run it for him. It was called CHUC, but on the street it was better known as Upchuck Radio. It took many years and a lot of work to turn it around. I'm going to skip the details of how we got to today, other than that I purchased the company in 1991. Suffice to say that what we did to grow our little company out of bankruptcy in 1983 is not much different than how we operate the company today. It takes hard work, a dedicated staff, fiscal patience, and a strong community involvement. Local radio reflects retail. When retail is down, as in this past year, then radio revenues are down. That means cutting expenses and staff. In small markets, there are not a lot of staff to begin with. We live very close to the profit-loss line. So add in the extra expenses this past year for new and retroactive copyright tariffs, there was no profit. Our small main office is in Hamilton Township. We're one of the largest employers with about 25 staff for our two stations there. Our new Peterborough studios have about 15 staff. We desperately need more staff, but with the state of the marketplace, we can't afford to. And yet, when I have to figure out how much to pay in copyright fees for each of our stations, we're classed as bigger than a typical medium-sized station. I can tell you that we're small, and that small classification should be closer to $2 million than $1.25 million. Before I get to talking copyright, I'd like to spend just a few minutes to explain just how a small market radio station survives. We build loyalty. Not only do we daily talk about the community and promote the activities of community groups, but the staff become personally involved in the community. We talk on air about what matters. If it's snowing, we talk about what school buses are canceled. If council voted to limit garbage to 2 bags, we put the mayor on. If the 401 is shut down, we tell the best detour and give a toll-free number to call and update us. We do not subscribe to a costly national news service. Most days, each of our newscasts are 100% local. We are part of the disaster plan for the various municipalities. When the 2 water pumps went down recently in the town of Port Hope and an emergency was declared, the town coordinator called me at home to set up airing messages to residents. Local emphasis extends throughout our programming. The Community Booster Club, twice an hour, promotes community events at no charge. We put community groups on air to discuss their event. This is not just a casual relationship. Their success helps build loyalty to our brand and ultimately helps build a better community. For example, the Northumberland United Way supports 16 member agencies. We promote the United Way itself and each of its member agencies, and each fall we air a weekly live update with the campaign chair. The Canadian Blood Services, since my leukemia bone marrow transplant in 1987, we do live broadcasts every month from the blood donor clinic. Our stations were instrumental in the success of the first annual anti-bullying awareness event sponsored by the Northumberland Youth Advisory Council. Through an on-air campaign and interviews with those involved, we brought county-wide awareness to the issue of bullying. And Relay for Life is the Canadian Cancer Society's largest fundraiser in Northumberland County. Our stations have sponsored this event every year, and in 2011 alone, the event raised over $270,000. There are many, many community initiatives our stations support, financially and through on-air campaigns. I could give you a list of community groups that we've worked with in the past year, but in the interest of your time, I'll not read them here. All our staff walk the talk. We're all directly involved in many community groups. I myself am past chair of the United Way campaign, the United Way board, the Hospital Foundation board, the Waterfront Festival, the Coburg Rotary Foundation Committee, amongst others. In addition to many charitable organizations, Northumberland has a large arts and music community, and our stations make airtime available to help promote their activities. For example, Summer House, a local rock band. Our station was the key supporter of the release of their debut CD, and they are interviewed and perform on air regularly. Zach Werner and his band Haymaker. Our station hosted studio live performances and interviews with Haymaker during the release of their debut album and subsequent fundraising efforts with the ALS Society of Canada. Blue Sky Revival, our concerts to raise environmental awareness, featuring an all-Canadian lineup of established musicians and emerging artists. We provided on-air campaign as well as on-site support with organizational assistance and an MC. We've developed a great relationship with people in the music industry over the years. They understand that our stations want performers to be successful, and that we will do what we can to help promote those artists. Community extends to our high schools and our community colleges. Each semester, we provide co-op training for 3 to 4 students from the 4 high schools. And each spring, we also provide co-op training to students taking various radio courses at Loyalist College in Belleville and others. And our staff sit on various advisory boards at Loyalist College. Pioneers Broadcasting is not some big corporation with a head office and a lofty office tower. We don't have vice presidents. We don't have unlimited funds for staff. We are community folk, not afraid to get our hands dirty. We want to be a good promoter. We would like to do even more in our communities. We want to be a good employer. We'd like to hire more staff. We believe in supporting the artists who make the songs that allow us to put a product on the street. But we believe in fair play. And I don't think being forced to pay multiple times for the same thing is fair. In the past, we received music from the record labels on 45s, then even up to 4 years ago on CD. We've always got the music from the labels, and we've never had to pay for it. It doesn't make sense that because they now force us to download digital tracks that we have to pay for them. In each of our stations, the music is downloaded to the very same computer that then plays it back over the airwaves. The only other time a clip might be copied is to create a promotional ad to tell listeners about the artist. So if anything has changed in the 39 years that I've been in radio, is that we have reduced to almost nil any need to copy music. I've told you of our shortages of staff. Is it fair play, then, that you would pass a bill that requires our company to reassign one of our very busy staff members to erase and re-record every piece of music in our library every 30 days? You're just adding prohibitive costs to our operations. So let's say I've got 3,000 songs in our musical library. Let's say they average 3.5 minutes. That's 10,500 minutes. When re-recording music, we'll have to do that in real time, which would take, let's say, 175 hours. If a person works a solid 7 hours each day, they're going to take 25 days to re-record that library. And they're going to have to do that every month. I'm asking you to remove the requirement that music be deleted every 30 days. The resources required to do that are just beyond the scope of possibility for a small operation like ours. Simply put, the 30-day limit doesn't make sense, nor does the fact we should be paying any reproduction tariff. Folks in the music industry know how important radio airplay is. That's why they've always worked with us to get performers on the air. We know how important music is. That's why we pay our copyright fees for broadcasting. That's why we promote the artists. It's a fair balance. To conclude, we're a small private broadcaster trying to make our communities better. We're trying to be good corporate citizens. We're trying to be good employers, and we're trying to grow our business. We promote the music and the artists we play. We pay the copyright royalties, but ever-increasing tariff payments are threatening our ability to do all of these things. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Mr. Conway, and congratulations. You were under 10 minutes. So
Thank you.
We'll hand it over now to Mr. Mackay.
Thank you. Resound is the not-for-profit collective dedicated to obtaining fair compensation for artists and record companies for their performance and communication rights. We represent the royalty rights of more than 12,000 musicians, including featured and session musicians, and record companies. The money we collect is split 50-50 between the performers and the labels. We appreciate that many of you have had your fill of copyright discussions, so I can assure you we would not waste the committee's time if our proposals did not align with the economic and job creation goals behind C11 and if they were not properly in order. Resound has tabled 3 straightforward proposed changes to C11. One of these is highly technical, so in the interest of time, I invite members to consult the background document and proposed amendment language we've given to the clerk. On this amendment, I'd only state that it is a very simple language omission in the Copyright Act related to ministerial statements on reciprocity. The other 2 amendments, I believe, warrant some more discussion at committee as they mean more money for more people. The first amendment would bring needed clarity and would allow Resound to get millions of dollars out of a trust account and into the hands of musicians and businesses. The Second Amendment addresses a serious market distortion in the current Copyright Act that dates back to the 1990s. Fixing this would inject millions of dollars a year into Canada's creative sector at no cost to taxpayers or consumers. The First Amendment is what we call the Orphan Amendment. What are orphans in the copyright context? They're eligible rights holders, musicians or labels, who have not yet signed up with us at a particular point in time. They may not have signed up because they don't know about their rights, or they may not have made a recording or have existed as a band at the time that a particular tariff was set. The concept of orphans is not unique to us. They also exist in the context of reproduction rights, retransmission rights, private copying, and others. The difference is that in all of those other cases, there are clear and express provisions in the Copyright Act that set out clear rules and obligations with respect to orphans. We are alone in not having these kind of rules and this kind of clarity, and can only think that this was an oversight at the time of drafting. Without any rules in the Copyright Act to clear up what obligations we have to these orphans, we may need to hold some funds indefinitely. To correct this problem, we simply seek an amendment, it's 2 lines long, that would give us the same clarity regarding obligations to orphans that all these other collectives have. In short, this amendment would provide clarity on the entitlement of orphans to be paid, empower the Copyright Board of Canada to establish clear rules around limitation periods, and crucially, it would allow Resound to pay out millions of dollars in royalties that we've been forced to hold indefinitely due to the lack of clear rules under the Copyright Act. Our job at Resound is to collect and to distribute money, not to collect and hold money in a trust fund. We're a flow-through organization, and we need clear, transparent rules in order to do our job. If you can make this technical change to the Act, we'll get money, that's money that's already been collected, out the door and into the hands of the rights holders. The other amendment that I will talk about today is the elimination of the $1.25 million exemption for commercial radio in Section 68 of the Copyright Act. The last time that the Copyright Act was reviewed in the mid-1990s, Canada was in the middle of a deep recession and the future of commercial radio was uncertain. In 1995, for example, the entire Canadian radio industry, that's the entire industry, posted a total profit of only $3.6 million. So the government of the day enacted a, quote, special and transitional royalty rate, end quote, section of the Act Under this section, performance royalties to musicians and labels were phased in over time, and each commercial radio station was only required to pay $100 on their first $1.25 million in ad revenues. This was and remains the only such subsidy in the Copyright Act and the only subsidy of its kind in the world. Fast forward to the last few years, and radio has been thriving and posting record profits in every market, in every language, and in every region of the country. In fact, between 2006 and 2010, the Canadian radio market experienced the second largest absolute increase in revenue in the world, behind only China. It grew by $330 million. This growth story is great news, and I want to be clear, we want to see the continued success for commercial radio in Canada. However, because the Copyright Act has not been reviewed since 1997, neither has the $1.25 million subsidy been reviewed to reflect the huge and growing profits of the Canadian radio industry. All the while, musicians and labels, including hundreds of Canadian independent labels and musicians, are not receiving fair market compensation for the content they provide. This subsidy reduces the royalties earned by musicians and labels by about one-third, or $8 million a year. The bulk of this subsidy goes to a handful of large radio groups, not small radio groups, but the large radio groups. This is a serious market distortion that benefits a very profitable industry at the expense of those who create the content that drive that industry. Once again, I would state that we love radio, and we recognize the tremendous work that many stations do in their communities, but please remember, commercial radio is a for-profit venture. That's why it's called commercial radio. And the business model is simple. Stations play music because music draws listeners. Listeners attract advertisers. In fact, 13% of all advertising dollars spent in Canada are spent on commercial radio. That's the highest proportion in the world. Simply put, music drives commercial radio. It helps with the station branding and helps target and retain certain demographics. Our proposed amendment allows the musicians and businesses that invest in and create the products that radio puts on the air to get properly compensated. Remember, this is a legislated subsidy, so radio stations do not have any option but to be subsidized. To their credit, broadcasters acknowledge the importance of paying for music. In fact, the chair of the Canadian Association of Broadcasters stated to the precursor of this very committee that, and I quote, "We want to emphasize that broadcasters are not opposed to paying for the communication right." End quote. That is the paying of royalties to musicians and labels that Resound collects. As far back as 2005, the Copyright Board weighed in on this subsidy and stated, and again I'm quoting here, "Even the smallest of stations would be able to pay the tariff, and allowing large profitable broadcasters to escape payment of the full Resound tariff on any part of their revenues constitutes at best a thinly veiled subsidy and is seemingly based on no financial or economic rationale." End quote. So, radio acknowledges that they think it's important to pay for the communication right, and even the Copyright Board, the expert regulatory body that is tasked with reviewing all economic data before it sets fair rates, has stated that every station can afford to pay the full royalty rate. This amendment would have no impact on any other part of the Copyright Act and would ensure that $8 million a year is injected into the Canadian creative sector at absolutely no cost to taxpayers or consumers. Resound is very supportive of the goals behind C11, particularly to generate economic activity and jobs in the creative sectors. We believe the two amendments we've detailed today align very closely with those goals, and we would be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mackay. So we will now start our first round of questioning for 5 minutes. And first up is Mr. Braid.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Good morning. Thank you very much to all of our witnesses for appearing this morning and for your presentations. Mr. Conway, I wonder if I could start with you, please. You explained in your presentation that you believe that radio stations shouldn't have to pay for the same piece of music, digital piece of music, multiple times. Could you explain to the committee approximately how many times today a radio station pays for the same piece of music, and then what would be different under C11 down the road?
Well, firstly, we're charged with reproducing music. And as I stated in my presentation, it is the record labels who have set up the server. They moved from CDs about 4 years ago to a secure server. In fact, they set me up when they did it. Let me take you through it. They have a server. The server knows your typing speed or how you type something in, so only you could download something. I don't know why they did me. I guess it's just to show me how to do it. And so I have one particular individual that would go for that station to the server, get the music, download the music to that computer, and then it gets played back on that computer through our system on air. So there is no multiple copies of the music that's downloaded. And yet that apparently is what we're paying for in the various tariffs. And I just don't think that's right.
Okay. Now, you spoke about a concern with respect to the 30-day requirement that's currently in the bill. It sounds like you're perhaps seeking a technical amendment with respect to that. Is that fair to say? And could you elaborate a little bit?
Well, the 30-day it just seems really really strange for radio. It maybe worked for some other part of the whole copyright thing, but for radio, if I got to take, I'm already short-staffed. If I got to take somebody and reassign them, so that is their sole responsibility, because I just took it 3,000 songs, and it's going to take roughly 25 days in real time for them to re-record all of that music. That means I got to take that person away from what they're presently doing, and that sole job is their responsibility then to re-record our whole library every month. And to me, it seems like a waste of time. And I'd much rather have that person doing something. I'd rather grow our business so that our tariffs that we pay are based on revenues. The more that we grow our business, the more the artist is going to benefit. So instead of taking it at this end, allow us to grow the business, they're going to get more dollars.
Now, when a radio station like yours plays an artist's piece of music, who wins? Who benefits, in your mind?
Well, ultimately, it's a win-win on the whole thing, because we're taking a product that the artist has created, so we're taking their music, that artist, we're putting it on air, and we're then adding value to it by working within our community to create community awareness. I mentioned a whole bunch of different community groups that we support, how we tell people about snowstorms, or be it whatever what matters in their daily life. So in fact, we take this product, we pay for this product, we enhance this product, and if we grow, we're actually going to come full circle by helping to give more dollars back to the artist, in simple terms.
Okay. Now, Mr. McKay, I'll turn to you. I heard two different things this morning. Mr. Conway said that particularly local radio in Canada is on the edge of the profit-loss margin. And then you explained that radio is posting record profits, particularly as compared to international markets as well. So could you speak to that?
Sure. Yes, in terms of the numbers that we have and some of the quotes that I was giving before, they come straight from Copyright Board decisions. And the Copyright, when they render decisions on tariffs like commercial radio, they go through all the economic evidence presented by the radio stations in terms of their ability to pay tariffs. So they specifically assess that. They're the expert regulatory body to do that. And so the evidence that they evaluated through that process, that was evidence presented by the CAB and by radio stations, led them to the conclusion that every radio station in the country could afford to absorb the full tariff.
Mr. Conway,
Sorry, Mr. Braid.
address that perhaps through another
Sure.
question.
We're already over time, so unfortunately, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Braid, and witnesses. Now to Mr. Angus for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you. This has been a very interesting discussion. It was making me think of when I was first starting out in music, and we'd go to the radio station, and we had a record. And if it was going to get played, the record gal down in the library bought the record up and played it. Now when you go into radio, there's a guy sitting behind the desk, and everything's on a server, and all those other people are gone that used to have to rack your record and bring it up and move it around and keep it filed. They're all gone. So we're now in a situation where the radio station can press a button and the song gets played. And, I love radio, what it does. But, when I hear that it's all about snowstorms and telling kids when the school buses close, that's great. But nobody phones the heating company and says, hey, give us a break on our heating bill this month because you know what? We do a lot of good community work. Nobody says to the telephone company, hey, we don't want to pay our phone bill. But it seems that when it comes to musicians, the artists, that there's a sense from the Conservatives that paying them is a problem. That they should, the win-win is they get a bit of free publicity. But I'm thinking that this whole business model was based on a relationship, and a relationship that is adjudicated at the Copyright Board. These tariffs aren't made up. They're decided. So, Mr. McKay, you're talking about this $1.25 million subsidy that allows radio stations not even to pay, basically get the stuff for free. Is there any place else in the world that does that?
No, there is no place else in the world that has a subsidy for commercial radio.
Right. Well, I'm just thinking because all the Canadian bands I know, most of them are pretty much hand to mouth. So radio is essential for them, and it's a great relationship. But I'm thinking, why is it that a band like Beto and Soundclash has to work for free, whereas the telephone company doesn't? If it's adjudicated by the Copyright Board, do you think it's right for the government to come along and say, you know what, copyright royalties don't have to be paid because we don't like them? Is that fair to maintaining a reasonable business model for musicians?
Well, the 1.25 million exemption is, as far as we're aware, the only provision in the Act that prevents the Copyright Board from doing what they're there to do. And when they have looked at it, every time in their decisions, they set out separate rates for low-use music stations, for community radio stations, for all-talk radio stations. That's them doing their job. They take into account the size. They do graduated rates according to the size of the radio station. So they're the experts on doing that. They listen to all the evidence. The 1.25 million exemption prevents them from actually doing that. They can't do their job because of that exemption. And it's the only instance where the Copyright Board is not left to do their job.
So you're saying that amounts to about $8 million. So we have $8 million there. We have about $20 million in the mechanical royalties that will be struck. We have about probably another $30 million that the Copyright Board had figured was in updating the digital levy. That's a serious amount of money in an industry that has been pretty much reeling and on the ropes. Do you think that we can address some of these shortfalls in the bill to ensure that we maintain a reasonable business model so that the creative community can continue to actually create the music that's driving radio, that's driving Canada as such a world leader? Can we do that with this bill?
Well, we certainly hope so. And in terms of the 1.25 million exemption, as I said before, it's in a part of the Act that was called Special and Transitional Royalty Rates. It was very much a product of the time and where radio was at the time. Those times have changed. Those times have changed a lot. And it's been 15 years since that legislation was enacted. So yes, I think it's very much time that that was dealt with.
Thank you. Could you just explain the Orphan Rights Clause? I think it's a really key element.
Yeah, the Orphans' Rights Clause is, as I said before, every other collective licensing regime and even reproduction rights regimes in the Act have clear rules that set out that an orphan, when they come forward later along, they have the right to claim monies. And it also sets out the ability for the Copyright Board to set clear regulations and clear limitation periods for claims and rules as to how claims come forward. In the absence of that, we're left relying on different provincial legislation, different legal opinions as to what our obligations may be to different rights holders. And that's problematic because it's not clear, it's not transparent. And what we're asking for is the clarity so that we know exactly who we should be paying and how to go about doing it.
Thank you, Mr. Fortier. We're already over time. Maybe you can get that in one of the next questions. Thank you, Mr. Angus. Now, for the next 5-minute questions is Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. I listened to Mr. Angus. I guess he has a little beef with local radio. I don't know why, but we do appreciate those messages that we get when our kids are going off to school. And in a day of satellite radio and so many hundreds of options out there, local content in our communities is certainly valued. Mr. Conway, on the issue of Canadian broadcasters, local stations, how you see their role in supporting Canadian content. Mr. Skolnick listed some of the performers in our communities that we value. What do you see as your role in allowing those individuals to make a living, buy a house, raise a family in Canada, make us proud both nationally and also on the international stage as we develop our talent here in Canada? How do you see the role of the local station?
Well, I think it's a pretty important. Everything that is local is that's why we call it local radio. It doesn't matter whether it's a community group or it's artists. I mentioned in my presentation about some of the local groups that we've brought in and done live performances in studio with. We work with many others. If they're putting on a fundraiser, we're helping to promote their fundraiser. If anything we can do to help local bands, that's what we do. I mean, that's part of our mandate that we feel is our mandate as local radio. We just were lucky enough to be awarded the license for Peterborough by the CRTC. As part of us being in that market, the Canadian content development, we promised that we would spend $175,000 over the next 7 years promoting Canadian content. And there is Showplace Theatre, there's the Festival of Lights, there's the Kiwanis Music Festival, there's Factor, and there's one other one I can't. There's 5 things that, and I've already met the high schools, journalism students for the high schools, 2 scholarships each year. So I've met with all of them now because this is our first year. We just got on air this past summer, and I've now met with all of them so that we can how we can meet their needs. So just cut a check, no. We want to get right in, that's what I told them. We want to get right involved in helping your organization. This is going to be a win-win relationship for at least the next 7 years.
Now, I'll throw this to Mr. Mackay and also to you, Mr. Conway, for comment, but you mentioned the person hours possibly labor-intensive with this with some of the changes that are coming in on the 30-day rule. We have seen so many technological advancements in the last little while. Do you think that technology could play a role in the future as stations are dealing with future issues in lessening that burden? I'll throw it open to either one of you.
Well, certainly what we're talking about in terms of performance communication rights, technology does not play a role. It is just the right to perform and communicate the music over the airs. So technology has not changed that at all over the years.
I thought what Mr. Angus, unfortunately he's gone. I thought what Mr. Angus had talked about with, oh, I used to, take it in and now they just push a button. When we bought the bankrupt AM radio station in 1983, there was 12 of us that operated that station for a number of years, 12 of us. Right now, in the Coburg office, we have 25 folks, and in the new Peterborough station, we got 15. So 40 staff over 3 stations, 13 point whatever number of staff. So all this technology that he was talking about has not reduced our staff to, like, you can't go lower than the minimum. You got to have a certain number of people to run a radio station.
Basically, you have 3 seconds left, so if you have a very quick
30
question.
30 or 3?
3.
Okay.
And
thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. Thank you, Mr. Conway and Mr. Mackay. Now to Mr. Regan for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for coming today as witnesses. This is a little different, having government so involved in making decisions that will affect whether or not industries thrive, or individuals in terms of artists thrive. There are many industries in this country where that doesn't happen as much, where government's far less involved as an arbiter in that way, and in the way that the CRTC plays a role, and in the way that Parliament in making legislation will play a role in your case. So we have to ask ourselves, I guess, in view of the fact that we are involved in this, about, okay, how do we ensure, and what is the role of government in ensuring that small radio stations, that industry, that artists, that all of them thrive? And should we be worried about every single one of them? I mean, I don't think any of you would ask that we ensure, that government ensures that every single station or business of any size makes a profit, because really in a lot of ways that we don't control the various factors in terms of productivity and their business models, or that every artist is going to prosper and become well, because not every artist will survive, and maybe some, I suppose if I were singing, people would say that I shouldn't be doing that and shouldn't be making a living at it, for example. I'm sure many of my sisters would certainly argue that. So the question is, how do we do that? How do we ensure that both artists and for instance, small radio stations survive? Mr. Skolnick?
Well, I agree with you about the government intervention. I can tell you it was a shock to me to find out that the government paid my salary when I started writing music. I had no idea. And I appeared before that time the Copyright Appeal Board, and I looked at all these people that were getting paid a heck of a lot more than me, and realized that there were 3 people up there that were determining what type of food my kids would eat and what clothes my wife would get. I, of course, never bought any. But anyway, how to ensure it? We've gone a far way. And federally, we've done status of the artist, which permits us to bargain on behalf of musicians. And so Mr. Conway's station, for example, is susceptible to that. If we can go into Peterborough and we can ask the K-Part to have him sit down and bargain with us to make sure that those players are compensated properly, or different actions can take place. So, but we haven't. We haven't gone around to every small town and done that, and we can't. We have relied upon the community to determine that. So yeah, we are dependent on the local radio stations. We are dependent on the local theaters. We are dependent on the local clubs. But and we have let the market take its place. That's why the supplemental income that these people need to keep going is so important to us. That's why the licensing to ensure that artists can continue and continue without having their supplemental income diminished, that artists can continue if they have a project to go to a bank and get a loan, that this continue. And the only way so far is through the licensing either of the performance or the performing. So It is federally regulated. It is internationally regulated. When you look at WIPO, it's not something we're going to change, but it is something that we need to look at, that we need to make sure remains rejuvenated, remains there as a level and an ability for all of our performers, all of our creators to take part in so that they can continue to present this country to the rest of us.
Thank you. I only have 7 minutes. Is it 1 minute left? Oh, this is so compressed. I need 30 minutes. But Mr. Conway, you talked about the fact that you've always got music from the labels and never had to pay for it, and you start out with 45s, of course, and so you've seen big changes. Of course, so have the artists, as you know, and they've gone from the time when they got lots of revenue from selling records that people like me would buy to a point where they aren't selling nearly as many, and they have a challenge. So what's your answer to this? How do we ensure that artists get revenue and that a small station like yours survives? Should we make a distinction based on the size of radio stations?
Well, I don't have any problem paying artists. I mean, I've never said that I had any problem. I think that we should. Okay, but it's got to be a fair balance. One of these that we're asking to do is what we're doing right now in the last couple of years. We're paying multiple times for the same thing, so we supposedly have multiple copies on hand. Well, we don't need it because it comes to one computer. We're asked to, and that's where you asked the question about government involvement, and I'm not sure that I see government being involved in this, because when government gets involved, you get to something like this 30-day thing, which just, in our case, just doesn't make sense. You know, why put somebody to work and reassign them from doing something else just to re-record something it just doesn't make sense. I'm sorry. So I don't see government being involved in this. If we can grow our revenues, the artist is going to get more revenue, bottom line.
Thank you, Mr. Conway and Mr. Regan. That ends our first round of 5-minute questions. Moving on to the second round for 5 minutes each, starting with Mr. Armstrong.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for being here. I enjoyed your presentations. Mr. Mackay, you've proposed an amendment that would repeal the $1.25 million exemption. That's correct?
That's correct.
Right. Mr. Conway, how would repealing that, I think you talked about actually expanding that, how would repealing that affect your small radio station?
I think I've already mentioned the state of affairs last year. Now, last year was, to be fair, was a retroactive tariffs. We were nailed with retroactive tariffs. So from us, maybe the big guys can swallow it, but us little guys who live on cash flow, it hurt. I mean, it created a non-profit situation. So when we live that close to the profit loss line and we have to determine whether or not we can hire another person here to do this, even though we really need to, if you're going to increase if you're going to take away the 1.25, that's substantially going to impact then on me being able to hire somebody else. And if I can't hire somebody else, I can't grow my revenues. If I can't grow my revenues, I can't pay the artist anymore. So you either cut off the leg over here or allow me to grow over here, one or the other.
Mr. Conway, you know, your business is obviously changing, and your business model is changing as it is. Technology changes everything. It's changing things for artists. It's changing things for producers. It's changing things for broadcasters like yourself. And you know, a recent change that's growing in radio, from what I've been told, is the impact of satellite radio. Have you seen satellite radio damage your ratings, or is the fact you focus so much on local content protect you from that?
Listen, we live right beside Toronto. There are 40 radio stations that come into our little Coburg, Port Hope, Northumberland market. Our stations finished #1 and #2. And the only reason we play the same music that those guys do. The only thing is, if there was a snowstorm, they can't tune to Chum FM in Toronto to find out what's happening to their bus number. That's why we finished #1 and #2. And that's the same model that we're now taking to our new station in Peterborough. That's the only way a local radio station can survive now. They've got to be 100% local. That's why we don't even subscribe to a national news service. All of our news is generated local. They go to the town meetings. They just make local newscasts.
So if you lose some of the support from the subsidy, you kind of have a niche market. Is that going to make it difficult for you to operate on a profit margin if you lose the subsidy?
Absolutely. If I can't hire somebody right now, at least It's going to delay it down the road because I'm going to have to put what I would pay that new staffer, I'm going to have to pay it over here to the tariff.
Good. Thank you. Mr. Skolnick, can you talk about piracy and how piracy affects and recently has affected your clients, your members?
Yeah, I haven't. That's not in our brief because it's actually handled, I think, by the CCA brief, which has also been put in there. But of course, it's a concern. It's something that we worry about, but we looked at different ways of dealing with it, and we're grateful for the government putting in some of the aspects to try and contend with it. We don't think it's enough, and we don't think necessarily that it's going to help. So I defer to what's in the CCA declaration rather than my own.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Conway discussed the 30-day erase issue, which is going to cause them some labor issues, trying to hire somebody else to put in place to that, or reassigning someone because of their sort of profit margin. What's your opinion on? Do you think this is an effective plank in this bill to re-record things after 30 days? What's your opinion on that?
Well, I don't even think there should be a 30-day exemption. I think you should just pay. But I support artists and I support getting them repaid. I mean, it's interesting to me that, and I understand that this is an extra cost perhaps, but why us? We're the product. We are we provide the content. Why not go to the power company and say, hey, we need a break in our rates because we use so much. Why don't we? I've no objection to subsidies. I just don't think they should come off the back of the artist. I think it's the last place it should come from.
You expressed support for the moral rights clause in the bill. Do you want to expand on that? The moral rights clause for artists.
Sorry, I should hear you again.
The moral rights clause.
Oh, would you like to hear about that?
Yeah, expand
and as briefly as possible, please.
Yeah. Okay. Moral rights is the right to control where your product goes, where your performance goes. I think the most extreme example, and it's possible, but if it's not controlled, somebody could find that their music underscoring a commercial for the Nazi Party or a porno film. Nobody wants that, and that can happen without. It's not the intention, but it needs to have more control. And I'm giving you an extreme example, but that's an example.
Thank you very much, Mr. Skolnick, Mr. Conway, and Mr. Armstrong. Now for the next 5 minutes of questioning, Monsieur Nantel.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to everyone for being here this morning. First of all, I'm going to put questions to you, and I'd ask for brief responses if possible. Mr. McKay, we worked together for Sony Music Canada in the 80s and in the early 90s. Two things occurred: a very bad thing for the music industry and that of creators, and a very good one for creators. Neighbor rights. I believe that notion appeared at that time, and there was Napster as well that arose. With regard to neighbor rights, I think Resound talks about this. I would like to ask you the following. We know it's important to underscore this. In Canada, the radio industry is an industry that's protected compared with the broadcasting in the U.S., for example. There are protections in place for broadcasters. The rights, if we compare them to other markets that are protected, are there rights that are comparable for the public execution of music pieces? For example, if you play music in a radio station in Canada, is it a bargain compared with playing music in another country?
You look at other Rome Convention countries, all of whom have neighboring rights. The rates there are not subject to subsidies, are not subject to legislated reductions. So that is something that is unique to Canada. Our rates, our overall rates on radio are lower than most other territories around the world. Yeah.
Merci, Monsieur McKay.
Thank you. I now have a question for Mr. Conway. Obviously, you're a radio station that plays music, but you do a lot of community work as well. And I therefore imagine that your music billing isn't gigantic. If you played music wall to wall, then I imagine that you would have a lot of music billing. My impression is that this bill is bring us back to the idea of taking money from Paul to give it to Peter. So to ensure that it doesn't cost you anything and that the artists don't get paid for the mechanical copies used by the radio, we're asking you to waste your time to do backup copies every 30 days to avoid having to pay. You don't like this process, I understand. Artists like to be paid, they want to be paid. My question is the following. Obviously, you're not a super music player, so to speak. When you play music, would you, or if you played more music, would you be prepared to pay a little bit more for public execution, public performances when music is played on the radio? It's a different situation. But would you be prepared to pay more to avoid all of the rest of the mess?
I understand the question correctly. We are a music station. The 3 radio stations that we do own are music stations. When we talk about local, is what we put in between the pieces of music that we are local, and so I'm not quite following where the questioning is going on.
I'll put it back then. Let's say now, I understand you tell me that you play a lot of music, and every time you speak, you talk about the snowstorm and local issues, and which is great. I probably would listen to your radio station if I was in your market. But what I'm asking you is that if you're so much bothered about asking one of your employees to go and make backup copies every 29th days, would you agree to pay more when you play music? A little more to compensate for whatever for this. What would you choose? Because since music is truly important in your programming, you don't want to spend that time. Are you willing to pay a little more when you play the music? Mr. McKay was telling us that we do have fair rates, and it's actually are lower than most international situations. Would you agree to pay more in order to pay less, let's say, for mechanical rights?
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for asking the question in English. Appreciate that. We pay all the copyright fees that are asked of us. What we don't particularly approve of is having to pay multiple times to keep copies. And the purpose of the presentation that I gave today is to tell our story is that we're not keeping multiple copies. We download it, we play it, that's it. Now, if you want to call backups copies, I mean, you back up a server. I don't know if that's really a copy. So I'm not quite following how else we would pay higher, because we're already paying all of that is asked of us. All I'm saying is I just don't feel we should be paying multiple times when we're not making multiple copies. We're not a big organization. So maybe in Toronto and Montreal and Winnipeg and Vancouver, maybe they have to make multiple copies of that to protect themselves. In our little station, one computer down to this computer, we don't pay or we don't play off of any other thing.
Thank you, Mr. Conway and Mr. Nantel. We're well over the 5 minutes. Moving on to the next round, or to the next questioner, is Mr. Calandra for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Conway, just to make sure that I'm correct, you pay for the music that you play.
That's correct.
Okay. Mr. Skolnick, I was looking at some of the previous testimony that we had. Actually, Mr. Regan suggested that if he was an artist, he probably wouldn't be a very good one. So if Mr. Regan is out there and he's made a CD, he is unlikely to have sold any CDs by the virtue of what he's told us today.
I didn't mean for you to carry on with that.
So if he's out there and he's not sold any of his CDs, he's got no radio play, how much how much is he making from the levies that you talk about? What is his cut?
From the levies, if he's not getting any...
what's he getting from
if he's not getting any airplay and he's not
No CD sales, no airplay. What's he getting?
He's getting his dad helping him. That's what he's getting.
What's he get? Sorry, what is it? Sorry, what is he getting?
No, he's earning.
He's getting
in
nothing.
that case, he's only earning from live performance.
All right, so he's getting nothing. So
But you might, if he's playing his own.
Sorry, I don't have a lot of time. Don't mean to be rude, but I just got to go quickly. So he's sold nothing. He's got no CD sales. He's got no airplay. He's not getting anything. He's not getting any royalties. So the more
he's getting live performance royalties, perhaps.
Okay, that's live performance royalties.
Yeah.
So it stands to reason that the more airplay he gets, the more CDs he sells, then the more revenue he gets. Correct?
It's a crazy formula. That is possible. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's possible, or is that real?
No, they have a system whereby necessarily airplay does nothing to do with this. Airplay doesn't necessarily
Record
get you
sales?
more money, but it could. Sales will get him more money. Sure.
So the more popular he becomes, and the more successful as an artist he becomes, then the larger his share of those revenues.
For him as an individual, but not for his band.
Okay. So how then does it follow? Because in your presentation, you seem to suggest that on average, artists are getting about $2,000 from this, and it helps with the recording time. But what you're seeming to suggest to me is that the more popular you are, the more sales you make, the more your revenue. So to me, it would seem to suggest that the more revenue that you're making, the less support you're going to actually need. So the $2,000 that you're maybe suggesting becomes a little less important. So you almost seem to be suggesting to me that the entire music industry will collapse and go away if this is removed. And I remember at the last, my reading of some of the last testimony, I think it was Maya Davies who said she hadn't even heard of that. I think it was Loretta McKenna who said maybe it was 1% of her income. It was very, very insignificant. Portion of her income. So these are fairly well-known artists. So how does it follow that the industry will collapse when the artists who are just starting out, such as Mr. Regan, actually have no real access to the funds that you're suggesting will force the industry to collapse, when it's actually the successful ones who actually need less and are getting more?
Well, Loretta McKenna is our member, and she does very well with live concerts. In fact, she doesn't have to do clubs anymore, so she's reached a certain echelon. Who I'm talking about, not the featured performers, I'm talking about the people that play for the featured performers. By the way, all this discussion about reproduction is a mechanical royalty, which musicians don't share in any way. Mechanical royalty is for the publishers and the creators, so that doesn't even go to players. Players get neighboring rights, and they get private copying. But
okay, so it stands to reason that the industry will not collapse. Musicians will not stop performing, as you're suggesting. In a follow-up, I'm sure somebody will follow up on us. Just for Mr. Mackay. I only got 30 seconds left, but I wanted to get to Mr. Mackay. Mr. Mackay, why you talked about unleashing some funds that you haven't been able to. Why have you not been able to do that on your own? Why do you need a technical amendment?
We haven't been able to do that on our own because there aren't any rules in the Copyright Act that set out how we can do that. And in every other regime in the Copyright Act, those rules exist, and the ability of the Copyright Board to set regulations exists.
How much is it? Sorry.
It's millions of dollars. Basically, if we can't locate 5% of the rights holders each year, it just grows from year to year. It becomes a bigger and bigger problem.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Calandra and witnesses. Now moving on to the next 5 minutes of questioning to Mr. Cash.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Well, this panel is very close to me, to my background. I'll fully disclose that I'm a member of the Canadian Federation of Musicians. So when the government tells us that we're following cues from our from our union bosses, I suppose this is my union boss, and I can confirm that I've never spoken to him in my life, especially around things that we vote on in the House. Okay. I do want to underline something which I think is very troubling, and that is that here we have essentially representatives of small businesses, musicians really are, and here we have a representative of a small radio station, and we are trying to make them sort of beat each other up over very small amounts of money. In fact, I'd argue that Mr. Conway's representation here does not really represent the shape of broadcasting in Canada. In fact, he's a small player in a very large business, and his issues are actually different than the majority of radio. That said, I wanted to ask you, Mr. Conway. Now, when you talk about having to make copies every 30 days, why would you have to do that?
As I understand it, that was in the bill.
Well, there is an alternative to making copies every 30 days, no?
To keep paying when we don't need multiple copies.
Well, not necessarily to keep paying, but to actually pay for the license.
To make multiple copies.
To make a copy, to retain.
Yeah, we paid the download fee, right? We didn't have to before, but now we do.
What I'm asking you is, do you not have an alternative to what you're describing as an incredibly onerous process? And we can leave that aside too, because that sounds a little odd too, that you'd have to record, make copies of 3,000 songs in real time.
That's what the bill says, sir. That's all.
I don't see that in there, but is there not an alternative? You could seek to go to the rights holders and get a license. Why wouldn't you do that? What is the issue here? So what you're saying is that rather than pay the license, you're going to make copies every 30 days. I just want to be clear. Is that what you're saying you're going to do if things remain the way they are in C11? That every 30 days you're going to make a copy of your library?
Ultimately, if you pass this bill, that's what I would have to do if I was not, because I would have to, as I understand the bill, and I am going to...
Point of order.
Just an important clarification that it's not in the bill. It's actually in the existing act, the 30 days. Okay. Just probably helpful to the conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Lake.
Okay.
Well, so just clarification here.
Stop the time. Time is stopped.
In C11,
the 30-day requirement is not in the bill. The 30-day requirement is actually in the act. It was in the act before. The bill doesn't change the 30-day requirement.
No, I understand that.
Because he'd referenced a couple of times that it was in the bill. Right. I just want to clarify that it's not actually in the bill.
Okay, that's
right.
Okay, so now we'll start your time again.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So what I'm trying to get at here is that substantively nothing. Your requirements as a broadcaster to retain a license from the rights holders.
I pay that license when I download it the first time. I pay that license. What is now required is that in the last several years, I now have to pay multiple times because supposedly I'm making reproductions, which I'm not.
Actually, the way C11 reads is that in fact you now have a 30-day exemption. So in fact, once you pay the license, you've actually got 30 days for free, right?
No, I've paid mine for 30 days. No. So basically, I've paid for 30 days.
No, actually, the way this reads is that when you get the copy from the record companies, you have 30 days essentially to have that music.
Okay.
And then at that point, you have a decision to make. You either pay for the license, or you copy it. And what I'm trying to clarify here is which you will do. Will you copy your library every 30 days, or will you go to the collective society, and which just about all the music that you play is licensed by collective societies. They have those licenses there. Which will you do? Will you make the copy, therefore avoiding the collective license, or will you go to the collective society and pay the license?
Sir, I'm just asking to be fair. I pay for a license to download a piece of music for which I never before had to pay. And then after each 30 days, basically on what you just said, I'm being charged to reproduce that. And when I don't reproduce it, I play it back on the same computer that I downloaded.
Thank you, Mr. Cash and Mr. Conway. Now we will go to Mr. Del Mastro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses today. I'm going to pick up on, I had a number of different questions I wanted to ask, but I'm going to pick up on this because it's really important. First of all, radio in Canada, and there's been a number of things said today, which, by the way, are not entirely accurate about what radio contributes to the music system, so I want to make this clear. To begin with, radio stations right now buy music, but the record companies don't sell it to the format in which they use. So then they have to buy the music a second time. That's called ephemeral rights. Ephemeral rights didn't exist until about 2006 when they actually started charging for it. And since that time, they've gone up in price. I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Conway, about 300% since they were originally brought in.
Honestly, couldn't tell you.
Or they've roughly doubled. They may have gone up a little bit more than that. I'll check to be sure. This is what the crux of the issue is. Now, when it's suggested that we subsidize our radio stations because we've got this $1.25 million threshold, what you're not pointing out, Mr. Mackay, is that our radio stations are contributing significantly to the Canada Music Fund and through Factor. A lot of companies don't have that kind of a tax that's placed on their radio stations. We also have something called Canadian content laws in this country, which over-the-top services like satellite radio, like YouTube, and all these other services don't have to compete with. That's something that local radio has to compete with each and every day. So when you suggest that they've got this massive subsidy that's supporting your business, you're not being wholly transparent on that because you're neglecting to point out all of these other fees, which are significant, millions of dollars. I believe the fees supported or provided into the Canada Music Fund by radio stations is about $30 million a year. It's a lot of money. And you're neglecting to point that out, so you're only looking at half of the story, and this is important. Mr. Conway, the crux of what is being discussed is that you have a value that is placed by the Copyright Board on music. You don't argue with that value. Your issue is that you're not able to buy the music in the first place in the format that you use, and then you are forced to pay again. Is that not the crux of the issue? Is that not what you're talking about?
I'm paying to make multiple copies when I don't make multiple copies.
Right. So this is what's called ephemeral rights. Right. So the bill does deal with ephemeral rights in that it seeks to strike them down. However, the bill suggests that in 30 days you must erase it or you must pay ephemeral rights. Correct? And what you're suggesting is this: it doesn't make any sense to say I have to pay for the music and then I can transfer it into the format that I use, but if I don't delete it in 30 days, I have to pay again for the music. That's your point.
Correct.
Thank you. That's exactly what I needed to get at. Now, you had actually talked about the $2 million or the $1.25 million threshold and increasing that to $2 million. What impact would that have on radio stations? How much money would that remove from the system? How much more are you paying in copyright fees having $2 million in sales than you would pay if you had $1.25 million in sales?
That's a very hard question because I don't have my figures at hand. And it's rather interesting because when I was writing my presentation on Sunday, I didn't know that this was going to be even discussed by Resound. I ended up looking, I happened to, when I got the copyright information back on 2 years ago or 3 years ago or 2 years ago when it came out, and it showed a medium station being 1.25, I just laughed because we're not a medium radio station, and we make more than that, okay, in revenues. So that's been my big concern. So here I thought, okay, here's an opportunity to tell some folks what that really means, is that while the folks that we pay the tariffs to tell you folks that a small or a medium-sized station should be 1.25, we're a small station and we have to make more than that, and we're still right there on the profit loss line. Okay. So that's why I just said, like $2 million, $2 million would be much better than 1.25. And now to come here and say, hey, they want to wipe it out, man, you want to kill me.
Okay. All right. I understand. I actually have a point that I want to make to Resound. I just started by saying I think you perform a necessary function, and I don't take issue with that with Resound. However, you'd probably have to admit local businesses and so forth. You're about as popular as a tax collector or cod liver oil to children. They don't like it when Resound comes in and hands out a bill. I am interested in this issue of orphan files. How many artists are we talking about, and how much money are we talking about redistributing if we get this fixed?
We're talking, as I said before, we're talking about millions of dollars. From year to year, it's about 5% of rights holders that this applies to that may join up with us after a tariff has been certified, may come along longer. So if you're looking at 5% of our revenues being sort of subject to this orphan provision on an ongoing basis, that's just going to add up year over year over year. Where our overall gross revenues are about $30 million a year. So 5% of that each year, this just grows and grows and grows.
Thank you, Mr. Mackay and Mr. Del Mastro. We are well over the 5 minutes there, so we will now go to Mr. Benskin for 5.
Thank you. I've got two things to cover, and I guess it'll be mostly the Canadian Federation of Musicians. First off, just the moral rights issue. I mean, I kind of liken it to, you build a house and you sort of and somebody kind of moves in and decides they're going to paint it orange and green and put a windmill outside, and you're supposed to be okay with that. If you own that property, it stands to reason that you should have some control as to how that property is used, whether it's for commercial use or not. So, I'm assuming that is something that is truly important to musicians or to artists and rights holders.
Yeah, it's vital. Absolutely, for the examples I gave. I mean, and not that these things would occur, but we're talking about mashups and unauthorized use. And the government, moral rights are a right in Canada, and we're grateful for that, and we're entitled to that. And that we just think that they need to be strengthened under this act. That it's not being looked after as well as it could.
Okay, thank you. I'd just like to get on to the funds distribution. You had brought up that mechanical rights and airplay rights are paid to the rights holders, which are the writer and the publisher. Right?
Mechanicals, yes.
Yes. Now, the private copy levy money that comes in, that is collected, that goes to all the people involved. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a very important distinction, because that's where the danger lies. When the session musicians and the background singers are not participating in the revenue coming in and being generated by this song, they themselves cannot then make a living. And not to use the rather histrionic, the sky is falling, the industry is going to collapse terminology. But this is something that has helped individual musicians, session players, participate in the money being generated by songs being played or becoming popular. Would you expand on that?
Yeah, exactly. A session player, for anybody who's wondering, or a side player, is someone who accompanies the featured artist. So when you see a band, you think that band remains intact. Most of the time they don't. Those are individuals that are hired by what's called a musical contractor or the musical leader to play for that particular artist, particularly in a concert situation and in recording. So the band that you see live is not the band necessarily that you will find in the studio. And those players who participate in neighboring rights through Resound and through the other collectives, that comes to, yes, $2,000-3,000 a year, and depending upon the airplay, absolutely right. And it's what's important is it's a source of income that they've come to depend on. It's been, and nobody's arguing with the principle, by the way. Nobody here at this entire committee says it's not correct. They get that. What we're arguing about is the means of delivering that and how it's stored and how copies are made. So we believe, and that's what we're asking the government to consider, to keep that principle in front and say, yeah, okay, so the technology doesn't work anymore, it doesn't make sense, but we need to find a mechanism that still upholds the principle, still gets this cash back to the players that have depended on it. It's a small amount, but it does pay. It does pay for studio time. It does pay for instrument maintenance. I mean, there are a number of different things, and it's been there for 20 years. So we're just asking for maintenance, not asking for something new, asking for keeping something that's been there for a long time.
Mr. Benskin.
That hasn't been around for a very long time. I would just like to, if you could just comment on, it's taken a while for musicians to get to that point where they could, where mechanisms were in place to make a living doing what they do. And my fear is that that things are being pushed back into a, here, we'll give you $50, shut up, go away, and we're going to make money on it.
Yeah.
Would you kind of expand on that?
Absolutely. It's a lot tougher now to make a living as a musician than it used to be. There is no question, and we thought it was hard then. We lived the 80s, I think, were the apex. I think that was the best time. And since then, because of digital distribution, because of a number of pressures, it's become more and more difficult. Some musicians, successful musicians who get airplay, have become more dependent on this type of supplemental income. So, yeah, no, the music industry is not going to collapse, and people are going to be creative no matter what. But it seems to me that in this country we should at the very least maintain the standards that we've established for them and encourage them. We've encouraged them by keeping these standards, and now we're looking at diminishing those standards. I don't think it's deliberate. I don't think anybody means to do it.
Thank you, Mr. Skolnick and Mr. Benskin. For the last 5 minutes, to Mr. Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the witnesses for coming. I just want to clarify, Mr. Mackay, you made a comment in your presentation when you were talking about the $1.25 million that you want to see changed. You talked about an opportunity to bring in millions of dollars at no cost to taxpayers and consumers, I think was the wording that you used when you referred to that now. Am I correct in understanding that if the rules were to change, that would result in a cost to a radio station of about $60,000? Is that about accurate in terms of the royalties they would pay? More?
The royalties that radio stations would pay more would depend upon the size of the radio station.
Right.
So a radio station that was right at the 1.25 mark would pay about $18,000. $18,000.
Okay, and based on what calculation, maybe, if you don't mind?
That's based on the rates that the Copyright Board sets. Even with the existence of this subsidy, the Copyright Board sets tiered rates. Mm-hmm. They set different rates for different types of radio stations in different sizes. They have always set a lower rate for stations under 1.25, and then they have said that they cannot apply it in our case because of this legislative
So if it was
provision.
a station of, say, $2 million, bringing in $2 million revenue, how would that impact a station like that?
A station at $2 million revenue at the moment pays nothing on that first 1.25.
No, but how would it impact it if your change was made?
They would pay, in addition to what they're paying now, they would pay the $18,000 for the first 1.25.
So $18,000 for the same amount. So, Mr. Conway, then, in terms of running your station, you say you employ, I think, 25 in one area and 15 in another. If you were to incur a cost to your business of $18,000 more, how would that impact your ability to hire people to do the things that you need to do? Would there be an impact on one or more of your employees, perhaps? Is that possible?
Actually, that's what I said in the presentation and did in a response before, is that any further payment of tariffs is going to impact me hiring someone else. So whatever we would pay for a particular, and it's a graded salary grid, so I'm not sure how the 18, but certainly would impact us hiring folks.
So it's fair to say that the idea that there would be no cost to any taxpayer or consumer, that would be incorrect. There would be obviously an impact to
this is all
the person that doesn't get a job or is had to let go because of the change in the rules, right?
Right.
Okay.
This is all in station.
I just want to clarify, Mr. Skolnick, I believe when you were talking about extending the levy to digital audio recorders, I used the terminology, I can't remember exactly, I quickly wrote it down, something about extended use of copies, storage, and duplication. It just kind of struck me. I kind of got thinking about the way I listen to music or use music. So, you know, in the past, say the mid-'90s, I would buy CDs, I'd get one of those storage towers and put them in the living room of my apartment. And then I'd have a few different CD players that I would play the music on. And I paid for my CD, but that was it. I paid for my CD and then I could play it. Now the parallel to that is that I buy my music. I may still buy CDs because sometimes I like to get the liner notes and things like that. But, you know, I store them on a computer. So the computer becomes much more convenient than the CD tower. And I can put the CDs away if I want. I play them on my iPad or iPod. In the past, it seems to me that this idea of paying extra levy for where you store your music or where you play your music from, it seems to me that would be like having a levy on a CD tower that I would buy from IKEA or, you know, the stereo that I played my music on in the past. Now, the irony here is that I actually buy, because it's more convenient, I buy way more music than I ever bought before. I spend more money on music than I ever would have spent before. So there's more revenue coming from me than before because of the new models, the new technology. And yet your argument is that somehow I should have to pay for my storage, I should have to pay additional for my iPad. I also have an iPod, so I pay additional now for my iPod, even though I'm playing the same music. I don't very often sit in a room and listen to it on 3 different devices at the same time. It's the same music. I'm listening to it, you know, on the same device, just as I would have taken my CD and played it on a CD player or a stereo in a different room. Why should I pay 3 times to listen to the same piece of music once I've paid for it?
Well, the storage I'm talking about is the capacity, and so I did the same thing you did. But if I wanted to have one if I wanted to take one on my Discman to the gym, and I wanted to have one in my office, I either carried it with me or I bought another copy. So that's the type of storage. The tower that you're talking about at IKEA, yeah, I had one too. I still have them actually. And that's because you needed the physical framework to put the different CDs in. So there's no requirement for that anymore. So duplication, you have to duplicate what the product is, and store it somewhere so that you can play it in your car, at the gym, when you're walking around. So that's what I'm referring to.
Sorry, Mr. Lake. You know, if you want to finish that very quickly, I'll give you.
I can say one thing. Yeah.
Rare is the consumer back in the day. You may have been one that would have had 3 copies of every CD you owned, one in your car, one in your office, and one in the gym. But I don't think most people operated that way.
No, but what I just wanted to say was that the principle is there for duplication. That's all. That people did get paid for that, and we think it's the technology that has removed that ability. And I think there's another means of recognizing the principle. I wouldn't get hung up on the technology. I don't. But I would like the committee at some point, and not here, to look at another means of how to maintain the principle.
Thank you, Mr. Skolnick. And with that, I would like, on behalf of the committee, to thank all of our guests and witnesses for coming today. It was very informative, and it was great to have all of you here. Thank you for that. We will suspend for 5 minutes and start in 5 minutes sharp. Thank you very much. to take their places, please. Thank you, Mr. Sweet, for your information. I'd like to welcome all of our witnesses from the Association Nationale d'Éditeurs de Livres, Aline Côté et Jean Bouchard. From the Canadian School Boards Association, Cynthia Andrew. And from the Association of Canadian Community Colleges, Michelle Clark and Claude Brûlé. I also wanted to make sure I said all of your names correctly. So each of you have been briefed that you have an opening 10 minutes, and so we'll start with the Association Nationale d'Éditeurs de Livres.
Bonjour, je suis Aline Côté, je préside le comité.
Good morning, my name is Aline Côté. I chair the Copyright Committee for our association, the Association Nationale des Éditeurs de Livres. Our association has about 100 French-Canadian book publishing firms throughout Canada. In all of the legislation we've seen over the past years, we've always reacted by asking for greater protection, at least reaffirming a copyright's existence in order to protect both our stability and our capacity with regard to revenue-producing publishing. What people don't always realize is to what extent publishing in Canada is faced with giants elsewhere, and we've been trying to gain back market share. In the 1970s, the French-language publishers owned about 20% of the market. The rest came from France or elsewhere, and the situation was roughly the same in the English publishing area. At present, we hold 51% of the market. It has taken us 40 years to progressively gain back this market share, develop the expertise, develop staff, professionalize our teams, the staff that we hire, and create a complete industry around books. One of the things that we have done as well is participate very actively with people from the Canadian Conference of the Arts in order to align our proposals with those of the rest of the cultural sector. This was without precedent in the world that cultural associations from all sectors in 2 languages succeed in agreeing. Weeks and weeks of work were devoted to this effort, and we were able to prepare a series of proposals, and we know that if they were accepted, we would really be able to develop our industries within Canada and prosper throughout North America. One of the things that the Canadian French-language book industry has succeeded in doing is adapt itself to the digital world. Very early, we developed a platform, a business model. We established partnerships, and we now have a chain for digital book sales that ties in with all the Francophone bookstores in Quebec and in France and elsewhere in the world. It's an original model that we've developed, and it's even been adopted by large publishing houses in France, in the U.S., etc. Contrary to other industries, people think that we're dinosaurs in the book industry, but we were really, truly proactive, and this was quite a coup. We had assistance from the SODEC, the Department of Heritage Canada, etc., and at present we're saying that this collective effort has cost a minimum of $25 million. We're talking about numbers here. These are numbers that have been verified and compiled. They're not projections or extrapolations of possible losses. This is what has indeed been invested. We know 2 things now. More and more, we hear talk everywhere that value added with culture is a factor of sustainable development, and several studies that have come out with WIPO show that the most important thing that ensures the success of cultural industries is the legal environment, intellectual property protection, and copyright. The 2 countries at present that have the best ratios for these factors are the U.S. and Australia, and they're the ones that perform the best financially speaking, and that's where the cultural industries have the greatest market share. So what we deal with aren't supports, CDs, records, books. Our main asset is intellectual property. It is something that is not material. This upheaval brought about by C11 has artificially created a situation that harms us. We succeeded in adapting to the rules on the marketplace. We have a Canadian industry that is truly Canadian, truly national, that succeeds well, that performs well, that's dynamic, but it could hold greater market share if we compared the situation we have here with what exists in other countries. We're far behind. We could do much better. There is still room for improvement. So for us, it's very important that this act move forward. What we've demonstrated is that with good rules of the game, the digital initiatives didn't impact negatively on us because we were very proactive. 6 years ago, we convinced the governments to help us. We developed and we invested preventively $25 million. And now that all of this is starting to move forward, that we've really caught the wave, we realize that there's an act legislation that could really imperil us, endanger us. There are all sorts of business models that are in place that work well, but this is going to create an artificial wave. It's not something normal. It's abrupt, and it's going to overtake us. And this is unfortunate because we've already developed structures. And something else that we'll dwell upon today, and I hope there'll be questions on this, is the very tight linkages we have with national education programs and systems for us. The book industry, if our education systems had to do outsourcing to develop the materials that they need in schools, they would create a book industry. So it's very important that we retain these linkages with culture, and the fact that we have broad overtures with regard to the right to use without authorization and freely our publications in the field of education. We feel that this shouldn't be impaired. It's very important for us. Aline is right. Publishers, book publishers, are the R&D department of the education departments in this country. And to improve the bill, you should remove Clause 29, the word education, from the exceptions. If we gave this to all education players, the right to use without cost books, this would be very positive. People fear intensive photocopying of their materials, and literature publishers fear losing the advantage of seeing some of their books studied in colleges and universities. Furthermore, this right is created even though educational institutions have no problem assessing materials thanks to the copyright licensing agencies. We're talking about 0.5% of the total annual budget for education in Canada, which is about $70 billion. In the absence of precise definitions of fair dealing, everything has been said about this exception. The government says it means restricted to a structured context, including private training, but not for the public in general. The Canadian Federation of School Boards and University Teachers says that is the right to reproduce a substantial amount of copyrighted work without permission or payment, while the Conference of Directors and Principals of Quebec says that the proposed exception does not mean in any way the end of compensation for creators. Let us resolve the issue this morning. It is open-ended, free, and without permission, but the condition is that it be fair. This one and only restriction to the free use of any given material for educational purposes does not protect the book industry in any way. This should be judged by courts. These costs are very high, and this will compromise middle and long-term investments until the courts will have decided on which uses are fair and which are not. In the absence of precise definitions in the Act, the Supreme Court developed a non-exhaustive list of 6 factors to assist in determining whether a use is fair: purpose, character, and amount of the use, alternatives to the dealing, nature of the work, and effect of the dealing of the work on the market. However, the court ruled that although the effect of the dealing on the market of the copyright owner is an important factor, it is neither the only factor nor the most important factor that a court must consider in deciding if dealing is fair. In other words, a court could conclude that dealing is fair even if it harms the market for a work. In contrast, in the United States, this factor is the most important, indeed the central factor. This gives American publishers the comfort they need to invest in innovative educational resources. If C11 passes as written, Canadian publishers and foreign investors would not have the same comfort level. This is why the second and most important move that must be made is to improve our law to make sure that the three-step test of the Berne Convention is incorporated into our legislation so as to become the basis on which courts will rely for the interpretation of fair dealing. This would, among other things, ensure the effect of the use of the work, ensuring that it would be prioritized in the determination of what is fair, and by the same token ensure our laws meet our international obligations. Your 10 minutes are up. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Cynthia Andrew. I appear before you this morning as a representative of the Canadian School Boards Association. The Canadian School Boards Association members are the provincial school board associations that represent over 250 school boards across Canada, and they serve more than 3 million elementary and secondary school students. I am an employee of one of the provincial associations, the Ontario Public School Boards Association, and I am the key staff person both in Ontario and within CSBA member boards on matters relating to copyright. And I am pleased to be able to join you this morning to talk about copyright and Canadian school boards. CSBA submitted a response to the previous copyright reform legislation, and it is my understanding that this committee has access to those submissions and does not wish to see ours again. So I thank you for saving me that time, and I direct you to that brief that was submitted to the committee in December of 2010. Our recommendations between then and now have not changed. Copyright directly affects all of Canada's school boards, and it is reflected in policies and practices in school board administration and in classrooms across the country. Technological advances have made the current Copyright Act all but obsolete. The lack of clarity that arises from this outdated legislation is the reason that Canadian school boards, along with other national education organizations, have been persistently urging the federal government to clarify digital copyright law. Therefore, CSBA is pleased with a great deal of what we see in Bill C11, and we want to see the legislation passed. We believe C11 is good for education in Canada, and with minor amendments to certain sections, it can be even better. I wish to highlight for you this morning some matters that are of particular importance to school boards. First, CSBA supports the inclusion of the educational use of Internet amendment. Technology has changed teaching and learning in Canadian schools. From kindergarten to advanced calculus, classrooms are filled with innovative new learning opportunities. The proposed Internet amendment is important because the current copyright law is not clear about the extent to which teachers and students and other educational users can legally engage in what are now routine classroom activities, such as downloading, saving, sharing text or images or videos that are publicly available on the Internet. Without exception, provinces are investing in technological infrastructure in schools, but without this amendment, Canadian schools may be legally obliged to forego many learning opportunities and curtail Internet use in the school out of concern that they may be breaking the law. The proposed amendment applies only to publicly available material. That is, material posted on the Internet by the copyright owner without password protection or technological restrictions on access or use. Most of this material is with the intention that it be copied and shared by members of the public. It is publicly available for those who wish to use it. School boards develop and guide and administer policy and procedures in schools across the country. Legislative clarity ensures that school board policies on copyright appropriately guide teachers and other board employees without restricting access to material that supplements and enhances the typical learning experience. It is important to remember that school boards are also creators of intellectual property. And as both creators and users, Canadian school boards believe that this legislation does provide a good balance, the right balance, between the rights of users, creators, and industries that market the work of creators. Secondly, CSBA supports and is encouraged to see the inclusion of education in the fair dealing provision. However, although welcome, we do suggest that the Education and Fair Dealing Amendment needs to be clarified. For this amendment to have its desired effect, the term education should be clarified by stating that education includes teachers making copies for students in their classes. This clarification is needed so that teachers may copy short excerpts from copyrighted material for their students. The wording of our proposed clarification is similar to the United States Fair Use Clause, which has been in place since 1977. Adding education, including multiple copies for class use, to the list of enumerated fair dealing purposes will not mean teachers can copy whatever they want. Simply qualifying as a fair dealing purpose does not automatically deem that all copying for that purpose is fair. Such copying must still meet the standards of fairness that are set forth by the Supreme Court of Canada. Third, it has been suggested that the education community does not want to pay for education materials, and this is incorrect. Education institutions currently pay for content and for copying of these materials. These payments come at both the ministerial level and at the school board level, depending on the material in question and depending on the provincial financial structure. CSBA is not suggesting, nor have we ever proposed, that school boards should not pay for intellectual property. The education sector currently pays hundreds of millions of dollars to purchase and license content, such as printed and digital curriculum in many formats, film, music, and art. With Bill C11, the education sector will continue to pay millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, and nothing in this proposed legislation alters our current relationship with education publishers, with content providers, with copyright collectives, or with the Copyright Board. Lastly, CSBA is not in favor of the amendment that requires teachers of online courses or students of online courses to destroy their notes upon completion of that course. This amendment is unreasonable and impractical. It does not reflect current practices in online learning, where teachers reuse their course materials each year that they teach the same course. Requiring them to destroy their materials will result in wasted time and will limit a teacher's ability to effectively teach that same course multiple times. In closing, the Canadian School Boards Association has always believed that a modern and balanced copyright framework will protect the public interest and produce many societal benefits. The need has reached a critical state as schools across the country increasingly rely on the Internet and other digital resources to deliver program. CSBA supports the passage of Bill C11 with the minor amendments we have put forward so that the necessary legislative framework exists to support Canadian students learning in a digital world. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Andrew. Now to the Association of Canadian Community Colleges.
Merci, Monsieur le Président et membres du
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee members.
Relations and Policy Research for the Association of Canadian Community Colleges. I'm accompanied today by Claude Brûlé, the Dean of Faculty of Technology and Trades at Algonquin College here in Ottawa. I would like to thank the committee for extending an invitation to our association to appear to speak on this important bill. The Association of Canadian Community Colleges, or ACCC, as it's commonly referred to, is the national and international voice of Canada's 150 colleges, institutes, polytechnics, cégeps, university colleges, and universities with a college mandate. With campuses in 1,000 rural and remote communities and urban, 1.5 million learners, and 60,000 educators, these institutions draw students from all socio-economic quarters and supply graduates with the advanced skills essential to Canada's economic growth and productivity. Canadian colleges host applied research and innovation projects carried out in partnership with Canadian business communities. Colleges play a pivotal role in Canadian skills development and building greater capacity for our Canadian economy. Copyright law is therefore important to them as both creators and users of copyright material. Colleges understand the need for balance and clarity in the Copyright Act. Bill C11 helps achieve this by providing a legal framework for areas of copyright law that are currently not addressed in our country's current written law. Digital technology is rapidly changing the face of post-secondary education in Canada. New technologies are providing teachers and students with fantastic opportunities for teaching and learning in many new ways. Without a clear and modern copyright law, teachers and students may have to forego some of these opportunities provided by technological development. We welcome the education amendments in the legislation, particularly those dealing with the educational use of the Internet. ACCC supports Bill C11, for it passes two fundamental tests for our post-secondary community. Number one, it strikes a fair and reasonable balance between the rights of copyright holders, owners, and users of copyright works. Number two, it has achieved in large measure being technologically neutral and meeting the needs of teachers and students today. ACCC recommends some minor amendments to Bill C11 that do not alter the essential balance that has been struck in the bill. A summary of these can be found in ACCC's brief addendum, which will be submitted to the committee in the days ahead. The addendum is relatively identical to the brief that was submitted last year by ACCC, with some minor modifications to reflect the new language in Bill C11. I would like to share three key points. First, ACCC strongly supports the educational use of the Internet Amendment. It is balanced, reasonable, and necessary clarification of rights for teachers and students in the digital age. C11 is needed to provide a clear, modern, and balanced framework for educational use of copyright in a digital age. Second, ACCC supports the addition of education to the fair dealing purposes. The fear that adding education will allow unlimited copying are unfounded. Copying must still be fair in order to be fair dealing, as set out by the Supreme Court of Canada in 2004. Colleges are not trying to get out of paying for copyright materials. Colleges have paid and will continue to pay for millions of textbooks, periodicals, course packs, digital databases, and collective licenses. Nothing in Bill C11 will change that. However, the bill needs to clarify that fair dealing can include making copies for a class of students, provided the dealing otherwise qualifies as fair. The U.S. has a fair use provision that is far broader in scope than what is proposed in Bill C11. The U.S. fair use provision explicitly permits the making of multiple copies for work of classroom use. Despite this broad fair use provision, the educational publishing industry in the U.S. would appear to continue to thrive. Third, Bill C11's digital lock provisions are unnecessarily broad. A better approach is to prohibit breaking a lock only if the purpose is to infringe. Breaking a lock to engage in a lawful activity such as fair dealing should not be prohibited. We urge the government to enact this legislation. This is an opportunity to safeguard Canadians' learning objectives for generations to come. I thank you for this opportunity. My colleague and I would be pleased to answer any questions the committee may have.
Thank you, Ms. Clark. And now we will start the first round of 5 minutes of questioning, and we're starting with Mr. McColman.
Well, thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for coming today and representing your organizations. It's interesting to see the interdependence of the groups and how they've had their basic structure of working together over the past and have succeeded, have faced challenges, no doubt, on both sides of the witness table here today. But as we go forward, I think what we're attempting to do has been said, is strike the right balance between those interdependent groups, and the witnesses who were here just previous to that are in the same situation, with bringing a piece of legislation that is fair and balanced. When it comes to education, we heard yesterday, again from a professor from the University of Western Ontario, that the current provisions that are set out are fair in the sense that teachers and professors and post-secondary educators and educators right across the full educational spectrum, for that matter, will have the ability to use this as they have in the past to a certain extent. And not a lot really is changing, in the sense that the new frame of reference or the new reference points will be put into this legislation for the benefit of all parties on a certain balanced scale. And that's where we're debating it at this committee. So in a general way, maybe start with Ms. Andrew with your views on striking that balance. You're in support of it. You have a few amendments. Do you think educators in general are going to change the way that they do things under a new Copyright Act than the way that they have been doing it and has supported that interdependence in the past?
I think that what we're dealing with in the education sector is that practice has outpaced legislative frameworks. And so because technology has been changing at such a rapid pace over the past, let's say even 20 years, because when I was in school they didn't even have photocopiers in schools, because technology is changing so rapidly, educators change with it, and the Act does not reflect those technological changes. And so what we're looking for mostly out of C11 and what we believe it does effectively is remain technologically neutral. It doesn't say specific technologies in it, which is good, because then as technology continues to change, we won't need to continually update the Act every time, but it brings Canada's copyright laws into a legislative framework that recognizes current practices with respect to digital copying and digital access to resources that did not exist before, and allows educators and students to use those within obvious certain restrictions in a classroom way, in a learning opportunity way, so that they can benefit from the information and benefit from the technology at the same time.
Now, to carry on, maybe Ms. Clark, you could comment on the next point I'd like to make, which is we've received a brief today from one of the organizations at the table here that's spoken, and it's titled "A Bill That Weakens Our Industry and Our National Education System." Now, that's pretty, to me, that's pretty alarmist in some ways to read. What's your comments about that?
Well, I haven't had the privilege of seeing the brief that is before you, so I'm not sure which organization it's from and what it says. But
it's actually from these folks at the end of this thing.
Certainly, the education community has for many, many years purchased textbooks. They will continue to purchase textbooks. There are millions and millions of dollars invested on the part of our members to be able to provide textbooks to their learners. Clearly, the way that education is delivered is changing. There have been incredible technological developments in the post-secondary sector, and the world of academics has changed. Their role has changed in how they educate learners to be able to get out into the workplace. We're all aware of the skill shortages that exist in our country at this time. There are some pressures to be able to get advanced skills out into the workplace to be able to meet those demands. And so colleges are having to really step up to the plate to incorporate some new technologies into their teaching methodologies and to be able to work with what's available to them legally to be able to pass that on to their learners. The Copyright Act is currently restrictive in the sense that there are provisions in it for fair dealing, but even some of the materials that are available, for example, through the internet that might presumably be free and publicly available, it's not quite clear as to whether teachers and faculty can use that readily to be distributing to their students. So there's on the internet side, there's some real advantages there for that to be changed. From the book perspective and the purchasing of books,
Very briefly, Madame.
Okay, I'll just ask my colleague.
We're well over the 5 minutes,
okay.
So we're actually closer to 6 here.
All
so
right.
unfortunately, we'll have to get you to answer that another time. Now to Mr. Angus for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the excellent presentations. I think we are all agreed we have a huge stake in getting this right. You know, my young daughter is suffering through grade 9, and when I get home, I look and she's reading the same crappy novels that I had to read in grade 9, and we were wearing bell-bottoms then. And so I think it's really important that we make sure that we have a vibrant textbook industry so that we can get new materials to our students, because God, those novels were bad back then, and I'm just doing a plug to update, get us some great new novels and get them to our classrooms. So, Madame Cotier, it's so important that we have a book industry that is feeding our schools and our education system, and I understand the concerns about fair dealing and how we define that. My question is, it has been defined by the Supreme Court, and even Parliament is under the Supreme Court. We have concerns if the language isn't clear enough, it could be misinterpreted, or they could say legislation means different thing than the Supreme Court. Would you agree that if we brought it in line with the Supreme Court decision within this legislation, then it would still be clear? It might still be litigation, but at least we would have a clear understanding of education here, and education is defined by the Supreme Court through the 6-step test.
The 3-step test is really important because it defines what it's going to be. Ça va définir ce qui est le principal critère.
It's going to define the main criteria. I'd like to say 2 or 3 things in response to what we've heard thus far. We're observing all sorts of practices that are telling us that C32 or C11 already have effects. For example, 35 universities are withdrawing from management collectives. 2 have given up because they realized that it was a very complicated thing, the management of rights. And we've observed a reduction of the purchases of material with interactive blackboards, etc. We're seeing a high trend away from class books. And all that the Supreme Court has said also underscores the fact that the use of or the fair use criteria are going to have to be reviewed. We have had no legislation for the past 15 years covering digital media, etc., and their university professors. You heard one yesterday. He perhaps didn't state this here, but they're saying, hurry up and get broad interpretations of what fair dealing is as defined by the criteria, so that when there is litigation before the courts, we'll be able to deal with the usages in schools as they're practiced today. You're saying that we're alarmist, but it's because we're already seeing things that are going to not only handicap us in our work to develop new materials and have us lose money, but we're seeing things such as, for example, the neutrality of the law, allowing transfers from format to format. Now, because of this, anyone can create a format of something, transform it from one platform to another, go from paper to digital, back to paper, etc. So there's tremendous loss of control along with these things that are allowed under the Act. If we lose this power with everything that is going to be available, for example, there are a lot of classrooms with iPads and digital blackboards, etc. This is all very interactive, but there's also YouTube that's involved. So anything that could be reorganized, put out on the net, etc., and reused in the classroom, we believe that this will have an impact on our ability to follow the traces of a work. Where is its origin? The work that I'm going to be working on, is it something?
And he's very strict. So, because I'd wanted to address the issue, because we talk about the 3-step, but we have it defined at the Supreme Court, and I think that the Supreme Court is where this will continue to come back. So I just have to ask Madame Clark a question. In terms of the long-distance learning issue, we're very concerned about the 30-day provision, because it seems that we're creating a 2-tier set of rights. We have enormous potential. I have a riding bigger than Great Britain. Many of my students, potential students, never get to a college, but they could take it on long-distance learning. Do you think that this provision to force the student to destroy the notes after 30 days will that hamper our ability to take the potential of digital learning environment?
At present, class notes are licensed.
But I only because I only have about 10 minutes.
And you have about 30 seconds to answer.
I'm going to be very brief, and I'll give most of those seconds to my colleague. Online learning is very huge for the colleges, and the 30-day does not seem realistic. It's not manageable.
Thank you. We're trying to create lifelong learners in a primarily knowledge economy. The thought of destroying intellectual property to prevent someone from having that with them throughout their career in the marketplace once they've graduated from an institution is not seen by us as reasonable nor effective use of the resources, both for the learner once they've graduated and may need to continue to rely on that material in their day-to-day work in the workplace.
Thank you, Monsieur Brûlé.
Thank you.
Now to Mr. Braid for 5 minutes.
I'm actually going to go.
Oh, okay. So to Mr. Colan.
I just want to follow up on the distance learning, just to get my head around this. If I'm a student at home. I'm watching my course at home. And there's a student in the class who's watching this, and the professor in the class plays a video. Does the student in the class, is that student supposed to tape the video so that they can, it's a copyrighted video, is the student in the class supposed to tape what he's watching or she is watching in class and carry that around with them for the rest of their life? Because the person at home, what you're suggesting, can or should be able to do that. So should the students in the class who don't have the benefit of having taped this have that same right? So should students be taping their in-class portions and carrying it around with them for the rest of their life?
I don't think that that's what we're suggesting. I do think my colleague might have a perfect example to share with you with respect to how online learning actually occurs. Certainly you have students that are, there's the textbook element, there's the notes element, there's the video element. Colleges pay for the use of materials that are copyrighted through license agreements, or whether that be through access copyright or through providers and publishers. But online learning is so huge in the post-secondary system that the expectations are that students will, when they're in the classroom, they can see the video. When they're at home, it's next to impossible to control what they're going to do with it. But it's not necessarily that we're expecting them to make copies of it. But I will ask my colleague to provide that.
That's my point, though, right? You're attempting to treat the student at home, and I've taken distance education the better part of a number of my last courses at Carleton University. But you're expecting that the student at home would have a greater advantage than the student in the classroom by what you're saying. And the bill contemplates that the copyrighted material used, not that the notes, it's not, nowhere does it suggest that the professor or the student after 30 days needs to have a big huge bonfire and destroy their notes and everything involved. What it contemplates is that the copyrighted information that Mme Cote says is so very important, that if that needs to be reused again, that be, I suppose, paid for and reused again. Why is that such a problem?
It's the students that are at home are not being treated differently. So let me ask Claude to give you an example of how it's used at his college.
Yeah, the idea is not to treat students differentially between modes of how they learn. If the professor is intending for the students to have access to this material, he or she needs to make it available to all students, whether they're at home, other side of the planet, or in class at that time. How that's done after the fact is determined by the teacher and the technology available. But there was never and should never be an intent to treat the students differentially, because that creates unfair learning elements in the classroom. What we're talking about here is elements of copyrighted material that currently under fair dealing practices we're attempting to be able to issue multiple copies of in the classroom. So the same could be said of a piece of a video, for instance, that the professor wants to have the students work with to write an essay or dissect and report on. they need to be able to have access to this beyond the live class activity in order to do that work. And it is not unfair to presume that they could have access to that the same way they have access currently to the printed version. To us, it should be the same. Now, we're talking about two different modes of synchronous or asynchronous modes of delivery.
But the debate seems to be that online or distance education will fall apart and collapse because, or become even less available because students are going to be burning all of their notes and teachers are redoing all of their lessons plans all over again. And that seems to be A, not true, B, completely unrealistic. And how would your institutions, if you don't turn off the course, for instance, 30 days later, and if I'm a student taking it, what stops me as a student from taping or taking a copy of that course and giving it to my neighbor and saying, oh, you're going to be taking it next semester, here's what you're doing, just watch it now and don't worry about it. To what benefit would it be for you to never turn that course off? How is that a benefit to your institution? How is that a benefit to distance education learners? And will that increase the availability of distance education if everybody's allowed to make a copy of your course and just disseminate it at will, put it on
30
YouTube?
seconds, please, Mr.
How does that help you?
I think we're not talking about the same thing here. What?
Ask this. Is it unrealistic to suggest that students and teachers are burning their notes after 30 days? Does this bill, in your opinion, force students to burn all of their course notes after 30 days?
It suggests that in Clause 27 at the moment.
All of their course notes and everything to do with that course need to be burned, not just the copy.
Point of order.
The time is up, but I'll go to the point of order.
The educational institution shall A, destroy any fixation of the lesson within 30 days after the lesson. So that is within the bill. That's what they're being told to do. So I think we have to be clear.
Now it's now a debate. We'll shut it down, Mr. Angus. That's more of debate. Thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Brule and Mr. Calandra.
I suggest that Mr. Angus read.
Okay, that's debate as well, Mr. Calandra. Thank you very much. We'll move on to the next person, to Mr. Regan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me see. I guess I'll start with Ms. Andrew. You've said that, in fact, you expect that with this bill that teachers would still have to meet the test of fairness set out by the Supreme Court of Canada. So, therefore, would I be right to assume that you would not be opposed to having that test spelled out in the legislation?
I think it's fair to state that by making one thing, the Supreme Court test has two stages, okay? And the first sets out those things that will be fair use purposes. And simply by making one thing, education, a fair use purpose, does not automatically deem that that one thing or any of those other purposes meet the standard of fairness set out in the Supreme Court. And so I don't see how in placing education as under the first step automatically means that it's going to pass the second step. It is not. And so by placing those things into the Act, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't foresee what sort of long-term ramifications that might have. I'm hesitant to say there's no danger in doing that because I haven't thought about it, and I'm not a lawyer.
All right. Let me ask Ms. Clark then, because you also said that you anticipated still being subject to the Supreme Court of Canada's test in CCH. So if that's in view of the fact that you're both saying that, I'm wondering what objection do you have to the recommendation from the editors, or the book publishers, that in fact this be spelled out?
Well, perhaps if I could just give you an example, and I'll try and do it briefly. If you had education in the fair dealings, in the first allowable instances for fair dealing, and you had a teacher in a classroom that wanted to make use of 2 pages of a particular book or a page of a particular book, for a particular class, for a class of 20 students. And there's only that one page of that book. The question would be, if it's for education purposes, it would pass the first test of the two-step test. The second test is it fair? And there are several standards to look at, 6 standards to look at with respect to is it fair. If it's one page out of one book for one class, one time only, to be studied because of a statement by an author, and it's for education, learning purposes in that classroom to get a point across, will it be fair? Compared to a professor who, same instance, for education purposes, wants to copy 5 chapters out of a book to share with the class. Well, then perhaps in that instance, it would not be fair, because it would still have to pass that second test. So I would suggest if education was in the first step, then you have 2 different circumstances, one that would be fair, one that would not be fair, and that it wouldn't pass the second test.
Alors, Madame Côté, avez-vous des commentaires sur cela?
Madame Gauthier, would you have any comments? One of the things you have to remember is that most class notes at the present wouldn't be covered by that type of provision because they're covered by licensing with collective rights management. So is it in the limits allowed under licensing, or do you withdraw from that because of fair dealing for education and that exception, or is everything up for grabs? We believe that the fact that this provision is there and controlled by external criteria, the 2 tests Madam has mentioned, we believe that the result of this will be that collective management, people will withdraw from it, and then the problem remains whole. If it is better circumscribed, first of all, there's a portion of the rights that would be paid, and they will remain, and they will ensure that the education sector will be able to do its work without problems. So we're suggesting that for all of that, we maintain provisions that would ensure the survival of collective management, which will allow classrooms to do this very well. And our suggestion is that with the 3-step test, it be limited so as to ensure that there is greater clarity with regard to what will be considered a fair use purpose, and so that with community courses, language schools, and all sorts of private courses that are given that benefit from this exception, that there not be an abuse, because this would be to the detriment of schools. We have developed an awful lot in this area in Quebec. It's 7,800 digital titles. It's constantly growing. We've increased this by 1,000% since 2011. So what we're accelerating are provisions to ensure that the schools have the materials, and we would like to see this not move from platform to platform without compensation and without licensing in extreme cases. But given the capability to transform formats and reproduction for classrooms, the new provisions under C11, although there are all sorts of things that will be included because they won't be subjected to the fair dealing exception. So it's all of these provisions taken together, knowing what case law is saying, that will be such that will be an important impact on the market. It's not just one of the provisions alone. It's the way they're interpreted. Thank you, Madame Couty.
First round of questions. Moving on to the second round for 5 minutes of questioning as well is Mr. Braid.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Madame Cote, I want to try to pick up exactly where you left off. It sounds like you have certainly embraced the digital age and that you're well positioned for that. It's my understanding, now I not only have one but actually 2 universities in my riding. It's my understanding that more and more universities are purchasing textbooks in digital format. Is that your understanding, and are you not well positioned to continue to take advantage of that?
Les universitaires ont une longue tradition.
Universities have a long tradition. Scientific, medical publishers were the first to ensure legal offerings, and universities indeed had access more quickly to digital works. In Francophone Canada, we're doing the same thing. We're increasing these offerings. I believe that one day technologies will resolve the problems caused, in the sense that we have an agreement with 1,000 libraries in Quebec, and we have chronodegradable files. They self-destruct after 30 days. So we don't have that problem. We don't have to ask if we're going to check what a student has in his iPad, or if we have to confiscate materials. No, we offer a license. We have fantastic agreements with our libraries. It could be done with the education departments, and these materials are biodegradable.
There's been a lot of discussion today about the notion of fair dealing. Do you believe that amongst the teachers in your school board systems across Ontario, that teachers will generally understand the standards of fairness?
I do, actually. I think it's important to point out that that while C11 provides a legislative framework that clarifies what is allowed and what is not allowed in classrooms, it doesn't substantively change the way we pay for those things. Okay? So the Copyright Board has set a tariff for Canadian schools, and it's $5.16 per student currently. We will continue to have to pay that tariff every year per student to ensure that we can continue to use digital and, well, actually that tariff doesn't cover digital, it only covers print materials in the classroom, so textbooks. And Mr. Angus was talking about old novels that his son is studying, and I'd like to point out that that's a matter of curriculum choices and not a matter of availability. There are lots of available resources that are not old, but I dare you to find anything better than Jane Eyre. And
or Margaret Lawrence.
But school boards will continue to pay for this tariff that allows them to use materials in the classroom, and teachers understand what is allowed in that tariff. It is set out not only at every photocopier, but there is a booklet that CSBA and the Council of Ministers has made available for every school board and every school in the country to understand copyright issues, and I know that those are widely distributed. Also, there's nothing in C11 that will permit blanket copying of resources. It will not allow school boards to go out there and, instead of purchasing textbooks, photocopy them. That is not allowed. It has never been allowed. It is not allowed under C11. We don't encourage it. We actively discourage it. And where it happens, then those teachers should be instructed by their supervisors about appropriate classroom resource use. Unless the boards purchase a license, which they have to do under access copyright, and they may do under various digital resources, they should not be using those materials without permissions. And that is our position. That has always been our position and will continue to be our position.
Great. Yesterday we heard from a University of Western Ontario professor. He actually suggested that he felt professors, universities are actually overly cautious when it comes to the application of these requirements. Is that the case in the secondary system and the primary system as well?
I would certainly say that teachers are extremely aware, largely because of a lot of the public media coverage that C11 has started to receive. They are aware of how using copyright materials in the classroom for them may differ under the law in their professional role than in their personal role. And so that is something that we've just begun working on with our colleagues, the Teachers Federations and other educational organizations, to talk to teachers about. But would I say that they're overly cautious? I would say they're overly excited about the new law, because one of the things that has changed is that there's now more resources, far more resources available than there ever has been for schools before. And so sometimes teachers aren't relying on textbooks the way, that doesn't mean there isn't a textbook. There is. They're supplementing with information that they would not have received before.
Thank you, Ms. Andrew. Thank you, Mr. Braid. Up next, Monsieur Dion-Labelle.
Oui, bonjour.
Yes, welcome everyone. Mr. Bouchard, you haven't spoken much to date, so my question will be for you. When we talk about an act to modernize copyright, there's a concern there that we should have. It's to protect acquired rights. This legislation should allow us to consolidate the acquired rights of creators such that we can even go further while ensuring that what is already working well remain in place. So the licensing system that was developed in Quebec, in particular in the area of education, is working well for the time being. And it provides compensation that's motivating, such that people continue to want to produce new materials. And this bill is threatening this system of compensation that was developed in Quebec. Could you tell us a little bit more about it? When I hear say that we'll use a page of a book in a classroom once in a while and it's fair use, what I say is that it would be fair to compensate the writer and the publisher who produced that, even though it's just one page. So writers work with publishing houses and editors. In the case of education, this is what I'm interested in order to constitute documents that fit with the programs, that are learning tools. The information contained in them is structured. They're validated scientifically. And we acquire all sorts of rights under whatever format in order to compile a whole that is truly a pertinent tool for classroom work. And the Department of Education validates this by approving the textbooks used. And Aline mentioned this earlier, and I would repeat it. Editors, publishers are the R&D department virtually for education departments. We provide the tools, and if you don't recognize and compensate sufficiently the work of writers, we'll lose their collaboration. We mustn't forget. What I understand in the application of the Act as it exists is that the very next day there are going to be people who are going to be losing money in the publishing area. Writers will lose money the first year right off the bat. I've been told $6 million that would be lost in the very first year. More than 6 million, says the witness. More than 6 million. How much do you think? 11 million. Right away. Right off the bat in the first year. And in the short term, you won't feel the hurt. We're talking about writers and publishers, but we're also talking about the education system. You won't hurt or suffer in the first year because the materials have been developed and they'll be in place and pertinent for several years. But when our departments of education want to renew their programs, who's going to be interested in investing in the development of the content? It's very complex work. We're talking about $1 million to $1.5 million of investment per resource per level. So for each discipline, each level, those are the investments to be made. So the people who are going to launch themselves in this field will do it because there's a stable business model well established and that there's no uncertainty. Madam Clark earlier was saying that colleges, but I'll stay with you, colleges, Canadian colleges, support or approve the measures, with a few exceptions, the measures contained in the bill. But I think that the Federation of Commission Scolaire du Québec, school boards in Quebec, disagrees with the bill as it exists. Yes, the Federation of School Boards of Quebec thinks what we think. They're aligned with us, and they think that the provisions of this bill will threaten the development of future pedagogical resources. There were amendments put forward. You discussed this issue with them. The Canadian Conference one of the amendments, I'll just read it quickly, does not apply the use of fair use to a use that considered isolated or else would have financial ramifications with regard to the value of the work. And that would be an amendment that would perhaps respond to the expectations and concerns that you have. Yes, indeed. And it would also serve the education of Canadians in the future. Go ahead. I'll take over, says his colleague. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to everyone for being here. My questions are for Ms. Gauthier and Mr. Bouchard still. Is it not your impression that unfortunately the legislator here could have sought more inspiration from the system in Quebec, which clearly seems to be working very well under the collective management regime? There was an agreement, and today, literally speaking, the bill is really creating trouble and dissent amongst parties that agreed previously. Yes, indeed, we sat side by side. We're all concerned by education for young people. But on the one hand, there are people who pay for the rights, who are in favor of the bill, and those who benefit from what work is done. So it's the return on our investment that's at play. It's unfortunate, but that's the issue. But in principle, we do work hand in hand most of the time. Thank you. That's all the time you have. Thank you.
Mr. Armstrong for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your presentations. I have so many questions and so little time here. I'm going to try to move quickly. First of all, Mrs. Clark, just back on the distance learning issue. I have a copy of the legislation here, and I'm going to read you a quote from it and see if you can tell me what's unfair about it or what changes you'd like to see. It says, subject to subsection 6, it is not an infringement of copyright for an educational institution or person acting under its authority to A, communicate a lesson to the public by telecommunication for educational or training purposes, if that public consists of only the students who are enrolled in that course, of which the lesson forms a part of other persons acting under the authority of the educational institutions, and it's clarified under reproducing of lessons. I wanted to focus on the reproduction of lessons. It is not an infringement of copyright for students who have received a lesson by means of communication by telecommunication, which I referred to earlier, to reproduce a lesson in order to be able to listen to it or view it at a more convenient time. So you can tape a lesson and look at it later. However, the student shall destroy that reproduction of 30 days after the day in which the students who are enrolled in the course to which the lesson relates have their final course evaluations. So if I'm a student taking a distance learning course, I tape a lesson off the internet or off of television, however it's broadcast to me. I save it. I can go back and actually look at it the night before an exam. But 30 days after I get my final grade, I'm asked to erase that. That sounds inherently fair to me as both an educator of 18 years experience as a professor and a teacher, and also someone who's taken a lot of courses online. Isn't it fair you would erase something like that would be copyrighted after 30 days of getting your final course evaluation?
Let me try and answer that succinctly. First of all, I'm not a lawyer, and so I'm not well positioned to be able to respond legally, if you wish, to your particular question. And I'm happy to come back to you at a later date, maybe in a week, with some details. I'll confer with my colleagues at the office. The element of destroying course online learning and being able to provide, as Mr. Brûlé said earlier, that opportunity for learners to be able to go back and look at that material whenever they wish to learn it. It is to establish, certainly, that the learning process is as fair for individuals that are in the classroom as it is for online learning. I've mentioned already twice, online learning is growing exponentially with the institutions, offering courses in rural and remote areas. In some areas, that's the only way to offer learning and to get to those particular learners. To require them to destroy those class notes in 30 days is very, very difficult. It's not manageable.
It doesn't say about destroying class notes. If I'm sitting in my home watching the lesson, and I'm taking my class notes, I'm not required to destroy those after 30 days.
No.
I'm only required to destroy the actual reproduction of the lesson I'm watching.
Yes.
So if I'm taking notes, I can keep those and I can refer back to them in later courses. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the reproduction.
Yeah.
A note doesn't mean a handwritten note.
Okay,
it means
this
something
is
that is
debate once again,
distributed
Mr.
to
Angus.
you
I'm
as
sorry,
part of
Mr.
your
Angus.
class notes. Those are what are destroyed.
Sorry, that's debate. So
I'm just clarifying what a note is. I don't have to destroy those.
If you're referring to the course note, the investment of the institutions to produce and prepare for these particular courses, it doesn't make any sense to destroy those after 30 days. They're reused. They're reused for other online courses, for other classes. And so it's not an efficient use of the materials to destroy them after 30 days.
Okay,
So we do not support
I'm going to move along to Mrs. Andrew as a representative of school boards. And as a school principal, I had to purchase educational resources. But I think you would acknowledge that teaching is different now. I mean, before teachers were responsible for teaching a course or teaching a subject. I think most school boards in the country have kind of switched the paradigm to now teachers are becoming more responsible for the learning of students, ensuring that all the students in their classroom are learning. I think you would agree with that, would you not? There's been a shift to that direction.
I would suggest that that's accurate, yes.
So as a teacher, you're required now to do more individualization of classes. You're to try to get more resources to actually meet the needs of individual students, whether they have severe disabilities in the classroom or whether they're a high-performing student, a high-achieving student. You try to individualize that instruction, and that requires the purchase of special technology for maybe students who are disabled. It requires the production of special resources for students who may be achieving to enhance that learning. Is that accurate? So you guys are facing a much more greater costs now than you would have in previous ways, because the way teachers are actually teaching individualization of course material that they didn't have to do before.
The costs that are increased for that purpose will be reflected not only in curriculum, but will be reflected in staff and infrastructure as well. But yes.
So this legislation will clarify
Briefly,
a lot of the details on that.
Just briefly, go ahead.
Well,
I'll give you the
this
space.
legislation will clarify what teachers can and cannot do and help them, because they have to use so many broad range of resources. It's going to be a real guide to teachers of what they can and cannot do.
What it does is provides a legislative framework for teachers to follow that did not previously exist, and that's important for clarity, yes.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Andrew and Mr. Armstrong. Now to Mr. Cash for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for being here. And I wonder if I think it would be helpful, maybe Madame Clark or Mr. Brulé, to give us a sense of how professors, how teachers actually build their course outlines and how they build their teaching techniques for their students, because it seems that what we've got in this bill runs very counter to the practices that teachers use today. So could you just give us a sort of an outline of that and how the deleting of their course, essentially their courses in 30 days, how that affects their work?
I think I'm going to let Mr. Brulé respond to that as the Dean at Algonquin.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Mr. Cash. Courses are built from, and certainly for colleges, from program standards that are established, learning outcomes, and those are passed on to individual courses. So you have a program. Courses are made up of different learning outcomes at the course level. Teachers will select material, either material that he or she intends to use solely in the classroom, or that he or she may want the students to also have by way of purchasing those materials, whether they're published materials or e-books or anything of that nature. How they construct their lesson plans will be based on an attempt to achieving those learning outcomes. And this will include possibly live in-class lessons, skill-based work, reading material, a whole host of methods in order to impart or facilitate the transfer of knowledge, and then assess and evaluate that those outcomes have been met. So they either rely on either textbooks or material they create themselves, and that material is purchased by the college, by the students as well, and the learning takes place with that material. It's supplemented by anything that can be found in the public domain, for instance, that can be appropriate for that class. Not sure beyond that.
No, okay. No, fair enough. And so when we talk about the issue of teachers. Would they have to rebuild their outlines every, I'm assuming every semester if
well, we've moved completely online.
Yes.
We have a learning management system called Blackboard. We are moving to a mobile environment for all our students. Students will bring the device of their choice, and they're already doing that, and interfacing with the college and our systems to gain access to their material that way. Everything that we do for one semester that is going to be reused next semester is stored, and we want to be able to continue to port that forward in the following term. It is not economically reasonable to assume that we would dispose of all of this and recreate from scratch. It is just not reasonable or economically feasible.
We've been focusing on distance education as it pertains to this 30-day clause here, but in fact, all students are completely wired right now, and I mean, I have one of my kids is in second year at Ryerson, so he's not in distance education, but all of his notes are online. He downloads those notes. He downloads the resources, and he's also paid the tuition, and he's also buying textbooks as well.
That's right.
But it strikes us as counterproductive for learning that those resources he wouldn't be able to refer to down the road.
Correct, and that's why we oppose that particular part of the bill.
And I'm just wondering as well. We've been talking a bit about the burn-free step and the 6 steps for fair dealing that the Supreme Court has defined. Would it, in your view, be helpful to have that more, that definition, that Supreme Court definition, clearly mapped out in C11?
I'll respond to that. I'm not, don't have any legal background, and so I'd certainly like to take that back to our organization and confer, and I certainly can get back a response to you in about a week on what position we would have on that.
Great. Thank you for your answer, and Mr. Cash. And now we're in the home stretch to Mr. Lake.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and again, thank you to the witnesses for coming today. Just want to clarify a few things. First of all, to Mr. Cash's comments, there's nothing in the legislation that requires deletion of courses or teachers' notes or the preparation materials that they do to get ready for class. There's no reference to destruction of notes per se that a student might make or whatever the case is.
Sorry,
this is
point of
order.
What this is.
We have to just be clear here. It's in the bill. It says that they will destroy 30 days after any of those notes.
The point of order is it's got to relate to a standing order that's being breached.
But it's just so that people back home don't misinterpret
Okay, on the point of order, so my time is not being eaten up with this, I will point out that it clearly doesn't say notes. It destroys any fixation of the lesson within 30 days, and it defines lesson at the beginning of the section that we're talking about, clearly does not refer to notes. And so if you're going to raise a point of order that isn't a point of order, at least get the facts correct.
Gentlemen, this is done now, so let's move on. So we'll start the time again for Mr. Lake and go forward from there.
So to look at the section that's being referred to, what it does say at the beginning is, for the purposes of this section, lesson means a lesson, test, or exam, or part of one in which, during the course of which an act is done in respect of a work or other subject matter by an educational institution or a person acting under its authority, and here's the key wording, that would otherwise be an infringement of copyright but is permitted under a limitation or exception under this act. So just to be clear, what we're talking about here is the allowance of an opportunity to do something that you otherwise wouldn't be able to do. Everything else in terms of the way teaching is done is still allowed the way that it always has been. Teachers will prepare their notes. My wife's a teacher, she'll still be able to prepare lesson plans and keep those lesson plans and use them in the future. But what it allows is a situation where, and I'll use an example, I don't know where Andrew Cash went to school, but he is a performer, and if he decided that he wanted to, one of the teachers invited him back to perform for a class, perhaps an arts class or something like that, he could go back and perform. Now, in our previous world where there wasn't distance learning opportunities, he would perform. Everyone would watch that. It would be part of the lesson, and they would learn something and maybe take notes on it, whatever the case, and everything would be okay. What's not allowed and has never been allowed is for a student to tape that performance and keep that performance forever unless Mr. Cash gives permission to do that. That's what this is trying to address. What it's saying is it's necessary to make a copy of this performance, or a fixation as the rules call it, so that a student in Nunavut could actually see that performance and take part in the class and be able to benefit from seeing Mr. Cash perform and perhaps hear him talk about his experience. But it doesn't allow them to keep a copy forever of Mr. Cash's performance, unless Mr. Cash, of course, decides that he wants to allow that, in which case, according to the first paragraph here, it wouldn't be an infringement of copyright anymore, right? Because, of course, Mr. Cash would have given his rights, given people the right to do that. That's an important clarification. I don't know if that, if you have any comment on that, but I think that really the focus needs to be on this as an opportunity that otherwise doesn't exist, and it takes nothing away from teachers or professors' ability to teach the way that they always have, or prepare the way they always have, or for students' ability to take notes on those things and keep them forever.
I would agree with your term of opportunity.
I think that the scenario that you just proposed is reasonable. That's not the advice that I was given by legal counsel when preparing my response to this bill, so I'd like to have an opportunity to talk to her about that again and just make sure that the information that we're dealing with is agreed upon on both sides, and then maybe I can respond in writing back with a more definitive answer on that, just so that I'm not misrepresenting. And what you outlined there is very different than the way I was instructed that the law would be interpreted. So I just want to make sure that I'm not misrepresenting anything.
And to be fair, that's one example. I think what you're saying is reasonable, and I'd appreciate that. I guess I'll just ask one follow-up question to that to Mr. Brule or Ms. Clark or Ms. Andrew, if you want to answer. Does it seem reasonable, in your opinion, that a student at a distance or within that class should be able to keep a copy of Mr. Cash's performance or lecture, whatever it might be, forever, without actually having permission from Mr. Cash to do so?
It was never the intention of the Canadian School Boards Association to allow students to keep and continue to use copyrighted materials that were provided to them for the sole purpose of their instruction.
Mr. Brule or Ms. Clark?
I guess my only comment would be that with the introduction of education under fair dealing, that there needs to be a reconciliation of this clause versus the need to have that balance with the fair dealing and the ability to pass on to students extracts of copyrighted material without infringing the law. And so there's, again, that balance here of here you're saying, on one hand, no, destroy all of this after 30 days. On the other hand, we're saying, but fair dealing in the context of the classroom allows us certain exemptions.
Again, though, the law is pretty clear when it talks about what has to be destroyed. It's talking about something that would otherwise be an infringement of copyright but is permitted under a limitation or exception of the Act. It's very clear on that, and I think that needs to be clear because there's all sorts of talk of destroying notes or destroying lesson plans. That is absolutely not the case, and it's crystal clear in the bill as presented.
Thank you, Mr.
Well, it's not crystal clear when people misrepresent what's actually written in the Act.
This is for clause by clause and the debate there. Thank you very much. So does anyone want to respond? Do you have a... with that, then, go ahead.
Just a point, I guess, since there would appear to be obviously between those of you here at the table some differences with respect to the interpretation. I think it's difficult for us to, obviously, we're not lawyers. Certainly, I'd be pleased to go back to my organization, get some clarity, and to be able to respond to all of you with respect to that as to what our position is.
Thank you, Ms. Clark, and to the members of the committee. Most of that discussion will save for clause by clause, and you can talk that out then. But I do want to thank our witnesses for coming today. Thank you very much for your information. It was very helpful for the committee. We are the hardest working committee on the Hill, so we meet again tomorrow, 3:30 to 6:30 in room 237C, and that's again at 3:30. And till then, this committee is adjourned.